Hello. My name is Amber, and I am from the land down under. I got to know Doug by reading an earlier version of this book that he has been working on for so long. I emailed him and told him how much I liked it, and he asked me if I would narrate this newer and much wider scope version. I said I would, so here I am. The essential purpose of this book is illustrated with the following two quotes. Donald Rumsfeld once said, "There are known knowns. These are things we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know we don't know." Doug adds, "and many things we have forgotten." This book is about forgotten ideas, why they are important and true, and why we don't learn them in schools. In later chapters, some of this will make you jump right out of your seat more than once, even if you have no interest in economics, theology, cosmology, philosophy, law, math or physics. So, enjoy the ride as we light a path through the antinomies of logic, dialectical illusions, Christian doctrine, Kantian true, good, and beautiful, and rational universal jurisprudence. So, onto The Arsehole Problem, by Douglas H. Plum, June 2024. The Arsehole Problem. Preface. When humans started writing books, they began writing about the vitally important topics of arseholes and bullshit. Plato's Republic, a book carved in stone 2,500 years ago, was about arseholes, and they didn't have it all figured out. Aristotle also had a lot to say about arseholes in his famous work, The Politic. It was the Catholics who continued this inquiry. There were not only the Catholics, but also people from all over who went to school in Rome to study law. If there were no arseholes, we wouldn't need laws, and we wouldn't need the theology it has to be based on. Churches speak of arseholes in terms of the devil and sinners, and law courts call them criminals. There is an arsehole playing one of the main characters in almost every movie. In ancient Rome, law and lawmaking were the technology of the day. Objective law was the technology of the time, as computers are now, and jurisprudence was the first thing ever called a science. The discovery and subsequent development of principles of jurisprudence by the English and Germans, on a foundation of Christianity, created the Christian West. Freedom led to the West's technological and economic growth, and it all rested on the foundation of an objective and scientific conception of right and wrong. Christianity is an objective universal religion, unlike any other, in that it provides a regulative doctrine based on objective principles rather than ethical and constitutive commandments. Scientific jurisprudence, Christian doctrine and the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, the great sage of Königsberg, during the German Enlightenment combined to give us an objective conception of freedom and an objective science of right. These are the ideas that enable us to identify arseholes. They could be said to combine into one science, an objective science of arseholes and bullshit. Kant's principal works were revolutionary in all three domains of the true, the good, and the beautiful, and are studied today in respective fields. In the late last century, Karl Emerich's work on the philosophy of mind rekindled interest in Kant. His book spawned many recent contemporaries. Philosophy is often said to have a pre-Kantian period and the post-Kantian period we are in now. The Kantian influence on Western society is wide and deep, yet, unlike Plato or Aristotle, this name is not commonly known. Kant was primarily an anthropologist. He invented that science. The popular pictures of the galaxy are depictions of the Kant-Laplace hypothesis, not actual pictures of the galaxy. Kant predicted modern physics and its never-ending search for smaller particles in the late 1700s. Kant is primarily known for his warrant for the belief in freedom and his warnings regarding the dangerous deterministic philosophies of a scientific materialistic era. This Kantian conception of freedom is much better and more straightforward than the confused ideas of today. It will naturally snap right into place in your mind. His ideas are as complex as ideas get, and his works are some of the most difficult academic philosophy one can encounter. This book shows the main ideas through examples rather than complex academic and logical proof. The reader should have a clear conceptual overview of Kant's three works, why they are essential, and how they all fit together with understanding, reason, and judgment in the conception of the beautiful and in the philosophy of mind. In addition, the reader will understand the key doctrines of Christianity, original sin, grace, and the Trinity, and how they provide a foundation for the science of Western jurisprudence. Many of the tools and doctrines of Western jurisprudence will be shown and illustrated to be the objective tools to be used in the identification of bullshit. Truth is often self-evident. Illumination is all that is required. I can't take credit for any of it because I'm just an idiot, like Socrates, who only asked questions. The questions I asked had answers in these books. I'm just going to light the path carved out by the greatest Enlightenment philosophers, Christian doctrine, and common law jurists. So, who am I to be talking about such lofty ideas? I don't have a PhD in the Greeks and can't read Latin. I'm not a Stanford PhD. I barely finished my undergraduate electrical engineering degree at a school you have never heard of. In 2001, I left a dream job, writing code to preserve my sanity. I could not think about all of this and do that simultaneously, and I couldn't stop thinking about all of this. I have no academic qualifications to write about any of this, but I have also walked a free and sometimes very intellectually demanding path of inquiry over the past 20 years. So, enjoy the ride as I light the way through dialectical illusions, Christian doctrine, how to identify bullshit, and how to think like a lawyer. For most readers, nearly all of this will likely be new. The reader will also learn why none of this was ever taught in public schools. The explanations I provide are not my own and are grounded in reason and logic. These explanations and demonstrations are the ones you will never see on a corporate platform, and they will snap right into your mind with almost no effort. DougPlum123@gmail.com preferred. DougPlum123@protonmail.com alternate. Also see my page on archive.org. Channel is Doug Plum, all one word, spelled with AB, plum as in plumber. The Asshole Problem. Introduction. There are well-posed problems and ill-posed problems. To pose a problem well, we need suitable expressions to express it most compactly and efficiently. Some say that people who use profanity lack imagination or the ability to express themselves. I'm one of those people. But if you cannot tell it like it is with language barriers in place, then those language barriers must be lifted. It almost seems like a conspiracy that we hear words like asshole and bullshit as profanity when they describe the profane so perfectly. It retards the language because these words are perfect in what they express. Too many people use profanity too often. It is laziness. But we need words to describe the profane, and they shouldn't always be viewed as profane. Everyone knows what I mean by asshole and bullshit. These two words are two of the best-known words in the language, making them helpful in framing a problem that we all see and experience. We use these words often in our everyday speech. Those who can express themselves well use them as frequently as those who can barely speak the language. I believe that if people understood what an asshole is, this knowledge guided their actions and thoughts, we would see a very different world than the one we see now. Constant change has become the norm, and for the most part, it's being brought to us by assholes. Knowing and understanding are two different things. We know crossing a busy highway is dangerous, but we do it sometimes anyway. In that sense, we don't always understand or stand under what we know. I'm using some better words to explain the reality that most people naturally know, but do not apply in their thinking. I wrote this as a deprogramming book and a book that clarifies concepts that most people already know. Clarification results in better usage of concepts and clearer thinking. Everything will fall into place in the final 3 chapters. First, there are some preliminaries of chapters 1 and 2 on assholes and bullshit. The hour is late, and it's time to tell it like it is. Lawyers think better and more straightforwardly than others on these issues, and to be educated, we must become better at thinking like lawyers. We must think more like lawyers to preserve Western law and freedom. A good lawyer can tell when a doctor is bullshitting without knowing a thing about medicine by using the method of cross-examination. Many people have already done great work in history and current events. Still, there are few rationalists in what we sometimes call the truth movement. Rationalist thought is being forgotten, and idealists are often viewed as fools. Socrates was an idealist, so was Kant, and so was Chesterton, and so am I. We need ideals to ground our thinking because ideals govern and control thought. Without them, we cannot navigate our thinking, become confused and easily led by assholes. It also seems like mass media and education are hypnotizing people to love both assholes and bullshit. Our new misguided conceptions of the beautiful and virtuous lead us into dangerous subjectivity. Hardly anyone wants to know the truth anymore. Anyone who has seen an entertainment hypnotist and can see through 1% of the bullshit in our media and from the mouths of politicians and scientists must find the idea of mass hypnosis both believable and likely. It is not only the leaders that are often assholes, but we, the people, have been educated and brainwashed into becoming assholes ourselves. We live in an emerging asshole society, and we have forgotten our understanding of what an asshole is. It hasn't happened by accident, and has something to do with how we talk about politics, some misunderstandings and misapplied concepts. We knowingly and willingly buy things made by enslaved children. We know the wars and foreign occupations are just done to export our corrupt money and war machine all over the world. We support wars as if they were good and noble. What does a society of assholes really deserve? Law is being replaced by rules to aid agendas set forth by oligarchies who, almost always throughout history, turn out to be assholes. Almost all kings throughout time and in all places turn out to be assholes. They become assholes under the pressure of kingship, or they were assholes to begin with. Not one would wish for a crown of thorns. There are a lot of stupid assholes, but I do not waste much effort in talking about them. Everybody thinks they can do this well, but if you can do it like a lawyer, you will do it better. The key is to recognize bullshit, connect it to the asshole spreading it, or at the root of it, and stop listening to that asshole. It seems simple, but in reality, it isn't, or we wouldn't have this asshole problem in the first place. I think we are losing our usually clear definition of the asshole, and this has to be, in part, because we are never given a clear definition of asshole. In public schools, they teach us what mass, force, sentences, and numbers are, but no one teaches what an asshole is. That is the job of the church, and churchgoers could say that I could use the word devil in place of an asshole, but there are many confused devil worshippers. Part of the motivation of this book was to unconfuse devil worshippers. I believe that people need to be reminded of what an asshole is, as well as be reminded to use their natural asshole and bullshit detection tools when watching TV, just as much as they would when buying a used car, if not much, much more. The science of jurisprudence is, for most of it, simple and intuitive, much more straightforward to learn than math or grammar. Lawyers are no longer taught this science, and this is due to the Administrative Procedures Act of 1947. All Western countries have it in one form or another. This gives the courts the right to assume that you have given up your rights because you are an idiot and cannot know or understand them. You become a ward of the court without realizing it, in the licentiousness and sophistry of their words. Agency gives right in Roman law, and the West has, in its great wisdom, practiced Roman law and English law. Western people have lost their agency because they have lost the language and understanding required for a formal agency. You can read all the laws themselves, but understanding jurisprudence in common law courts requires understanding some very natural and fundamental principles rather than memorizing statutes, rules of evidence, and procedure. The last textbook on jurisprudence I know of was published in the 1940s, and is called Theoretical Jurisprudence, by John Salmond. Many older ones are better, but this one is very good. You can find many of these as free PDFs on the web. It's good to read a few of them. Absurdism is a state where life is devoid of meaning or purpose, rendering the truths we derive from our sense of purpose and meaning irrelevant. In this state, we disconnect from the concept of objective right and wrong, leading to a potentially chaotic understanding of morality. The fact that rational theoretical jurisprudence isn't taught to lawyers proves that we live in an age of absurdism. Sophistry, licentiousness, and intimidation are the pillars that hold up our modern decayed skeleton of what was once rational, universal common law with a minimum of sophistry and escheat. Universal law is scientific rather than agenda-driven, and is a science rather than a philosophy. This loss of the West's foundational truths will result in a categorical loss of human freedoms. The oligarchs who run our society oppose ordinary people having time to think or energy to make change. Influential people want to keep and expand their power so it can never be questioned or challenged. No one likes to give up power, and most would like more. A business is either growing or dying. The same can be said for the power held by a ruler. Ecclesiastes 1-9 states, "The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun." There is a group within any group that determines the agendas. If this is not explicitly true, it is implicit. Kant calls this group the Illuminati, and one exists for any organization, secretly or in the open. Conspiracy theorists aren't crazy, and they are well read, and Kant was one. Philosophically, I am what people call an orthodox Kantian, and we misunderstand many things by not putting them into Kantian terms. 100 years ago, Plato, Kant, and Shakespeare were the most respected philosophers. Kant is genuinely monumental in philosophy, and many divide the history of philosophy into pre- and post-Kantian periods. He is an extremely difficult philosopher to read. Still, we mortals have Sebastian Gardner's Routledge Guide to the Critique of Pure Reason, and the knowledge to read Kantian logic before actually reading Kant. We have Henry Allison's and Beatrice Longnes, as well as many other modern scholarly works, if we want to understand Kant more clearly after studying original works. His ideas are studied by all kinds of students, from art to biology, the physical sciences, and the science of jurisprudence. This 18th century philosopher had groundbreaking ideas and innovations that are still relevant. Kant is the premier metaphysician on the subject of human freedom. No one can ever know whether we are truly free or merely machines. Kant gives a powerful warrant for freedom, which is why he is being slowly forgotten. Our owners do not want us thinking about law and freedom. This book is about law and freedom, and you have never heard it like this before. Kant is respected as much as Plato or Aristotle by many, and his most remarkable achievement is this warrant for freedom. Assholes of today want him forgotten. I will use Kantian terms to examine the political landscape rather than the typical left and right, democratic and republican, or liberal and conservative paradigm, which will make intuitive sense. Could I have chosen better words than assholes and bullshit? I don't think so, not without confusing devil worshippers. In fact, there is not a suitable word in the language. This creates a void in the language and poor lines of communication. The expression contemptible person came up on the web, but that doesn't quite fit, especially in these times in which we live. It seems like the real assholes are the least obnoxious persons, or even heroes for many. I could have used the word psychopath or sociopath, but those words only describe the most extreme of assholes. The term asshole has a well understood, clear, and strict definition. An asshole is someone that violates the universal law, treat others the way you want to be treated, the golden rule, the Roman right of self, Kant's categorical imperative, or the great unwritten writ. So asshole is a scientific term due to a strict definition, which cannot be worded perfectly, hence the great unwritten writ in the science of jurisprudence. The great unwritten writ is the precept from which Western law is created. The word arsehole is a form of expression for those who violate this unwritten law. There is no suitable word for this unwritten law, but we see who breaks it. Bullshit is different in that it is a descriptive term of art. The word narrative immediately springs to mind when I think of polite words that mean bullshit. Still, I'm not sure it's a good idea to equate bullshit with narrative. A narrative can be similar to a white lie in intention. Narratives are often necessary to provide a universal truth everyone can agree on. I look up bullshit in my Webster's Unabridged Dictionary from 1981, and there is no listing. I looked it up in my 1987 Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, which is significantly abridged. I found nonsense, foolish insolent talk, and to talk nonsense to deceive. I think this is the best definition. Sometimes, what is used to deceive is not nonsense, but the truth is just made to be taken out of context. So this doesn't fit. The word propaganda is also a possible fit, but not exactly. There is good propaganda, such as the propaganda that gets us to go out and exercise more, as we saw a campaign for that on television here in Ontario, Canada, in the 1970s. The word liar almost fits, but the techniques of art in bullshit have a broader scope than just being lies. Negative propaganda, or bad propaganda, could have worked. Still, it doesn't go well with the other part of the title, assholes, and one word is better than two when you need to use the expression all the time. I get a bunch of synonyms from the web, the only one I like is hogwash. But hogwash is simply an untruth, and so is bullshit, but bullshit is understood to be an art form as well as to be driven by a particular agency. I've never heard of a hogwasher. Bullshit is often, but not always, the art of the asshole. Some are that way for other reasons than being artful bullshitters, and no one has heard of artful hogwasher. I think the best definition I could find, to talk nonsense to deceive, hits it close, but bullshitters may not be speaking nonsense. Can you still be considered bullshitting when just lying by omission? It seems to me that being a bullshitter requires an action of some sort. The phrase bad propaganda seems to be the best overall fit to me. One word is better than two. If both the definition of asshole and the definition of bullshit could be found in a dictionary, they would be the two most important words in that dictionary. Lying by omission deserves its own word. It can be worse than lying by commission. There may be a word for this, and it's been kept hidden from the rabble, us. Lying by omission is the primary tool of the propaganda state. Things would add up if there were a conspiracy to prevent people from using or knowing this word, if it exists, maybe in secret libraries or languages. I couldn't find an expression for this on the web or in a few dictionaries. I can find neither assholes nor bullshit in my Black's Fourth Law Dictionary. These two words are used by attorneys and people who talk about attorneys more than anyone else. Maybe the attorneys plotted to keep these two words out of the dictionary. If people understood what an asshole is or what bullshit is, we would need fewer lawyers and fewer attorneys. I could have used words from the Christian Bible, such as sinner, but atheists would think themselves exempt. Devil worshippers would be again confused. It wouldn't have to be lawyers behind a conspiracy to keep these words out of the dictionary. Lots of people have a direct interest in preventing people from knowing what an asshole is. We really and truly are surrounded by assholes, which makes this such an important word and concept. Some people in power have no choice other than to be assholes. The public demands assholes in elections. We have required our elected officials to serve both us and private banking interests simultaneously since 1913. No man can serve two masters unless he is an asshole, so that is why it feels like we have assholes running things. It's because we do, and we have for over 100 years. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I identify bullshit and think about why we have so many assholes in power. According to Aristotle, in his work, The Politic, all of politics is conspiracy. The interest of a king is never ideally in line with the people and is often in opposition, such as usually the case with war. You can see today's reality in the pages of Plato and Aristotle. There is nothing new about assholes joining secret societies and getting involved in politics. There is nothing new about wars and why they are fought, and nothing new about corruption. The Republic of Plato considers the question, is it better to be an asshole? In Plato's Republic, the best life to have is that of an asshole that is seen as a saint. Kant, of course, addresses this question better, which I will explain in the chapter on total assholes. Before that, we must walk a path, carefully avoiding dialectical illusions and antinomies of common logic, and lighting the path through objective reasoning. Being an asshole at the ordinary man's level is still relatively prohibited. However, you can have empowered assholes at work and in other positions of power, and they are emasculated through political correctness. The asshole you meet in everyday life can just be thought of as a victim of retarded development that cannot be helped due to political correctness. There are few good new ideas, and I'm sure the solutions to our problems lie in what we have forgotten. We must remember good ideas and have the wisdom to identify bad ones. If we had the wisdom to identify bad ideas, we would not have so many new ideas and so much change. Most people have had their minds warped and twisted by Hollywood, network television, and public education. A well-educated person should be able to smell bullshit, but look around, and we can see this is not true. Most people are not familiar with basic principles of jurisprudence and often fall victim to the assholes because they believe a lot of what can easily be exposed as bullshit using a few simple techniques. Learn these rules, and you will believe a lot less bullshit. It will be a calm and cool sunny day in hell before the assholes of public education, network television, and Hollywood start showing people how to detect bullshit. I'm just an idiot. Like Socrates, I get my answers from everyone else. It's not that most new ideas are wrong, almost all of them are bad, including my own, of which this book is not one. Great ideas get remembered, and I wrote this book to explain, illustrate, and prove them. The Asshole Problem. Chapter 1, Assholes. I first encountered a book on this topic, Aaron James' book Assholes, a Theory, on mainstream bookshelves. The book has two takeaways that I wanted to elaborate on. Asshole is a distinctively Western term, and Westerners understand its meaning clearly. Aaron James defines the asshole as one that believes he can operate by a different set of rules than everyone else. I define the asshole as one who violates the universal law. Both mean the same thing, but my definition brings in the original sin, which gets deeper into the subject. James says that the masculine word is asshole and the feminine is bitch. I will use the masculine sense, or else some of those Rockefeller feminist bitches might complain that I am discriminating against women by focusing this essay on bitches rather than assholes. By he, I mean everyone and anyone. I'm not excluding transsexuals, bisexuals, homosexuals, or anyone else. The book has nothing to do with sex. Aaron James explains that you have to be careful about what you say because there are a lot of assholes that don't think others deserve the right to free speech. However, they cannot possibly believe their own words should be censored. Ideals trump reason and rationality in a world run by assholes. It's a great light reading book if you are interested. As James suggests, it's sometimes therapeutic to be reminded that you are not the only one facing this problem. The subject of this book is powerful assholes, rather than the everyday asshole we all occasionally meet. In day-to-day experience, there are two fundamentally different types of assholes. There is the arrested development kind of asshole, who cannot think beyond punishment and reward, and there is the kind with power. There are three critical observations on the subject of powerful assholes. The Republic of Plato states that 1. Secret societies exist to take something away from everyone else, and that 2. War is fought for money. The book is nearly 2,500 years old, but as true today as it was back then. There are universal truths in politics. And 3. The removal of narcissism as a personality disorder from the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual (DSM) in psychiatry has allowed this kind of asshole to proliferate rather than be treated, or somehow retarded from having jobs that may involve rational moral thinking of a higher order. Generally speaking, members of the public know what an asshole is, but they do not seem to apply this knowledge when making judgments regarding the politic of our society or recognize assholes from mainstream media. Minds turn off when the television gets turned on. The oligarchy's general interests, which control finance and establish boundaries for national governments to operate through implicit financial control, will never coincide with the average person's hopes, dreams and aspirations. People understanding things like assholes and bullshit is not in the interest of any oligarchy, and it never has been. Our owners write about what they want, but nobody reads anymore. Of course, it's all out in the open. Alan Watt, ex-guitarist for Alan Parsons and now the creator of Cutting Through the Matrix, cuttingthroughthematrix.ca, explains most of it. John Rappaport, No More Fake News, nomorefakenews.com exposes bullshit with humor. Globalresearch.ca is a scholarly and nearly irrefutable source on current events. Other favorites of mine to recommend are henrymccow.com and Ron Unz of the Unz Review Online. Henry invented the game Scruples and has a PhD in literature. Unz has the analytical mind of a theoretical physicist from Stanford University. The very word law implies universality. Law, whether physical, mathematical or moral, is universal. Western law has its basis in rational universal law, and its essential purpose is to protect you and me from assholes. As a science, this basis of universal law stands up well over time. Its initial precept, the Golden Rule, the single commandment in Christianity, or the Great Unwritten Writ, has remained the same over 2,000 years, whereas even physics has changed its precepts. First, Newton's work formed its foundation, and now, the more abstract ideas of Noether's theorem and symmetry form the basis of physics. Only math and moral law have not changed their basic precepts. Math and the universal law are both accepted as purely rational truths. The very idea of the asshole is as universal as the shortest distance between 2 points being a straight line. The law requires statutes or rules for its application. Statutes are written under the guidance of law by men. They make judgments less dependent on judges and shorten the time that would otherwise be taken by deducing verdicts strictly from first principles in a trial. A judge cannot take time to consult with philosophers. This is the Roman Justinian innovation to fight corruption, the judgments being made less dependent on the judges, who could be assholes. A modern fair system must have many statutes, but too many statutes can lead to statutory abuse. Too few leads to broad interpretations and room for assholes to move around in. Statutes need to be regulated, and the common law, or the idea of universal law, regulates courts to prevent statutory abuse. This is the great innovation of Christianity, above other forms of purely statutory religions. Christianity is revolutionary, rather than evolutionary, when compared to other religions, because it is regulative, and not constitutive. It regulates the legislators and their statutes so that assholes do not abuse us. It gives us in common law juries the principle of universal law to judge the application of written statutes. The great original writ of Western jurisprudence is universal law, sometimes called natural or common law. Common means common to all men, as well as expected in custom. Still, there are faults with every expression, so it is also called the unwritten law, or the great unwritten writ in books about theoretical jurisprudence. The void in our everyday language created a need for the word asshole. You won't yell, "Hey, you violated the great unwritten writ," as someone honks their horn for a neighbor at 4 a.m. beside your house. I cannot see why "don't be an asshole" could not be a modern expression of this common law, this precept that is necessary for this science of jurisprudence. Imagine if those words were carved in stone on every courthouse and had lawful force and effect. Like math having counting, and the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, is enough to be able to deduce almost all math. The ideal of "don't be an asshole" could be a precept for the purely rational and objective science of jurisprudence. The New Testament's single commandment is written in stone and has served the West well. It says the same thing. This is the New Testament's only commandment. The expression, "don't be an asshole," is an expression of Christian love. Christianity has the concept of original sin. No law or man can be perfect, and applied jurisprudence is filled with practical difficulties, as anyone who has been in a court, even as a witness, or watched Judge Judy on American TV knows. Douglas Adams, in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, mentions a guy, 2,000 years ago, who came up with the idea that the world would be a better place if we just treated each other better. Or in my words, if some people just stopped being assholes. Assholes ended up nailing him to a cross. Why so many assholes? The science of law knows a lot about assholes. Still, statutory lawmakers do not always know a lot about the law, and they are all assholes to varying degrees. People always vote for the lesser of the assholes currently running for office rather than run for office themselves. And they tend to vote for highly qualified assholes rather than less qualified non-assholes. We worship expert assholes rather than good honest people, as if assholes are required for the job. It's hard to find good, honest people who want the responsibility of power. Assholes ignore this responsibility and enjoy the privilege of power. There is always the kind that willingly puts himself into a position of serving two masters, the people and the financial institutions. No man can serve two masters. People fall into corruption, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. To be protected from assholes, we must have other assholes in power. It's the central argument for anarchy. It's the original sin. No man can be a moral ideal. We live in an empirical world. Satan rules this empirical world, the physical world of time and space, and the world of that cruel and unforgiving bitch, Mother Nature. Christ rules in the rational world, which is time and space independent, with the precept of universal law. In the New Covenant, he states that he is not of this world. Christ is all about reasoning that governs the understanding of rules. Reason regulates the application of written law through the great unwritten writ. The king is responsible for hanging onto power and stopping those who would undermine, reduce, or take it away. It's kings that require assholes under them, and kings have never been any different, and they will never change. Man can be led by principle or by kings. Statutory religions are for kings. The juristic religion of Christianity is scientific and based on principle. Thus, rule in a juristic society is by principle rather than kings. In short, Christianity and the science of Christian jurisprudence are the antidote to kings. Powerful assholes will always run the world to some extent, and their power depends on the people not applying what they know about assholes to what they hear from assholes. All men are sinners, a maxim of judgment in Christianity that lets us shape our political systems to minimize corruption. Assholes grew in great numbers when countries allowed private banks to print their money and made the countries go bankrupt. Elected governments now must operate within parameters set by banks and serve the public at the same time. No man can serve two masters, so everyone that tries must be an asshole to some extent. We live in a world full of assholes because the world is run by private money interests with great concentrations of power and, therefore, great concentrations of corruption and powerful assholes. The central bank can set parameters from which the government may operate. Reality is created by those with their hands on the purse strings. The central bank has direct, implicit control over governments by setting interest rates. It has the same power over governments when the country is bankrupt as when the banks foreclose on a mortgage. Most Western countries, if not all, have been bankrupt since 1933, and the banks have slowly foreclosed with bills and statutes that steer us toward their agenda. The central banks have no oversight, they operate autonomously and do not answer to elected governments. Alan Greenspan, a former head of the Federal Reserve, explained this himself in a YouTube video, which has been censored. Christ himself threw the money changers out of the temple. One does not mix water, the law of man, with wine, the law of reason, which gets better with age, unless necessary, and our corrupt money changers do not belong in a place of reasoned universal law. According to Kant, there are three kinds of societies: the juristic, the despotic, and the ethical society. A juristic society has its laws regulated by the common law, which creates the science of jurisprudence, hence, it is a juristic society. The despotic society is the anarchist society, where there are no laws to protect people from assholes that have power. It is a transitional state, as society switches from an ethical base to a juristic one, or from a juristic one to an ethical one, as we are currently experiencing with the neo-Marxist agenda. Ethics is an art because it isn't universal, and doesn't have precepts from which a science depends. An ethical system is a system run by men rather than principles. Ethical societies have precepts that come from the hopes, dreams and aspirations of their ruling classes, and ideologies rather than a requirement of law that is universal. This creates asshole law, and many people are demanding an ethical society, citing all of the negatives of the juristic society without knowing the basis, nature, and authentic history of the juristic society. This is an example of stupid assholes. Ethical systems somehow tell their members that they are more intelligent than those who believe in juristic systems, and that juristic systems should not be studied because evil white men created them. White men ended slavery and made the West the place where everyone on this planet wanted to live. Indeed, we, the ordinary people, black, brown, yellow or white, male or female, are blessed to live in such a free society, the likes of which are a blip in history never seen before. The West, in its juristic form, is not such a great place for assholes, although it has been slowly changing to an ethical form over the past century. In any ethical society, there is no yardstick from which to define evil. Evil opposes the agenda that establishes the ethic, the agenda changes, and the ethic changes along with it. Assholes multiply like fruit flies to protect the agenda and maintain the ethic as they slip into something people call the minnow trap. When trapped, a minnow follows an easy path to escape, which actually makes it more entrapped. A fish biting on a hook is another example. The fish buries the hook in its mouth as it struggles to escape the fisherman. If the assholes in Hollywood made movies about communist revolutions, the world would be a better place than it is today. This doesn't happen because the assholes of Hollywood are primarily communists. Blackstone's commentary on English law uses mean instead of stupid. Morality was taught, but sometimes not well understood by the stupid. C.S. Lewis explains that people in our scientific society study advanced topics and ideas, but do not have the moral education required to understand the larger issues associated with their power and influence. This creates what he calls clever devils. Being famous is used to denote fame for some great moral act. Now we have famous assholes. It's an inversion of good and evil. Chesterton explains the inversion that occurs when Christianity is lost when the right loses connection to anything objective. Assholes with power deliberately create a retarded development in society to create ordinary assholes that will accept a society run by assholes. Many people do not care or believe they have no power when all the power lies in their willingness to take responsibility, not only with votes, but with wallets as well, and not be assholes. Assholes cannot rule non-assholes. 100 years ago, we would have recognized the disadvantage of allowing corporations to export know-how and productive capacities. People buy things made by their relatives, friends, and neighbors. Now, we all buy things made by foreign enslaved people in ethical systems of government run for our short-term benefit of cost savings. We worship comfort rather than the good as our highest ideal. Rousseau explains that comfort is one of the great corruptors of humanity. Comfort makes us weak and stupid, and we export the power of the people when we export productivity. People losing power leads to people being ruled by assholes. John Locke said that a lack of communication is the source of all conflict. Defending ideologies at the expense of universal law requires censorship, increasing the possibility of conflict in principle. One can only look at the behavior of those pushing for an ethical society to see how censorship, and even violence, are used to quash contrary viewpoints. One can be arrested now for expressing contrary viewpoints to accepted narratives, challenging establishment ideals, or giving accepted narratives a cross-examination. Communication is the tool intelligent people use to resolve conflict. Understanding reduces conflict and can only occur with communication. Assholes often restrict communication to foment conflict, divide people, and create a society more easily led by assholes. Communication is also limited by immature and weak people who dislike having their ideas challenged. Having a valid opinion requires knowledge of both sides of an argument. To have a valid opinion means you believe you can win a debate. For that, you have to know your opponent's view, why it is wrong, and why he believes it to be true. You can only get this by listening, not through ignorance. What do you know that they don't? What do they know that you do not? Common ground is achieved with communication. People having common ground gives them defense from assholes in power. Champions of bad ideas don't like to be challenged or questioned when they know they are spreading bullshit. Insults in debates are usually just tools for the stupid and for bullshitters. Now, people are programmed, and modern university-educated people have no idea about anything called a juristic society, healthy debate, or anything that could credibly challenge their programmed views, which have been formulated and implanted by powerful assholes. Younger people don't have the life experience which teaches them about assholes and bullshit in the real world. Judgment must be practiced rather than learned from a book or teacher, and young people don't have the practice. They will stand and cheer for a more ethical society. They will stand and cheer as new, more powerful assholes take power, and the former assholes that were regulated by scientific jurisprudence slowly disappear. They will be the new useful idiots. The purpose of modern education is not to teach people how to think, but to teach them how to behave as a people ruled by assholes. And that is not to ask questions, or raise doubt or controversy. A publicly educated and media-educated citizen can be easily regulated with simple propaganda created by assholes. Propaganda usually takes the form of lies by omission rather than commission. The most significant aspects of history over the last century are rarely, if ever, mentioned on the networks, in Hollywood movies, or public education. Programming also involves ideas that get planted into the subconscious mind through movies created by the assholes of Hollywood. This is a straightforward and potent propaganda technique. Watch almost any movie that involves really rotten assholes. They are almost always visibly Christians. This gets people hating Christianity at the subconscious level. Then later, looking at facts that add up to historical lies of omission, written by assholes that reinforce their opinion, that is ultimately based on feeling and ignorance rather than fact, or a balanced and objective inquiry. Having our own opinions reinforced rather than challenged is both comfortable and dangerous. Assholes in power have painted the Catholics as evil with selective propaganda and lies of omission because the Christians have the cognitive tools to identify assholes, and therefore must be brainwashed to hate their religion, or be dumbed down, or destroyed to impede opposition that powerful assholes may otherwise face. The hard reality of original sin prevents a perfect society. After 16 years of Western public education, few people understand the concept and hard reality of original sin. Kohlberg's stages of moral development are simple, well-respected, and well-known. There are hundreds of short 5-minute explanations for this 3-stage model of moral development on YouTube. Each stage contains Part A and Part B, some of which are called 6 stages. I will explain this concept in a simplified 3-stage form to better match the context of this essay. In Stage 1, we have the people-pleasing level. The child seeks only to please those around them and please himself. Obedience and self-interest are the key words used to identify this first stage. Social pressure can be powerful. We all conform against our better judgment to some degree. And politicians operate from pressure from the electorate, as well as pressure to conform to long-term ethical agendas from the assholes that print our counterfeit money and occupy the actual seats of power. Politicians are representatives and, therefore, vote on behalf of the represented. The squeaky wheel gets oiled. The maintenance of a republic or democracy must fall on the citizens if authority and responsibility are to balance. There is no other way for a democracy to work. This requires a citizenship that understands that freedom requires eternal vigilance and that governments, like any other institution of man, are fundamentally untrustworthy. This is a consequence of original sin. All men are sinners. People became comfortable, unwise, and forgetful of this important maxim of judgment. The politician can work at stage 1, often willingly and knowingly. Pleasing your supporters defines the responsibilities associated with the job because, in reality, the politician's only direct responsibility is to get himself re-elected. Doing the right thing gets you negative media coverage from assholes and reduced chances of being re-elected from an electorate that mainly operates at this pre-adolescent stage of moral development and has their opinions spoon-fed to them by assholes. Somehow, in the media, politicians that were the lesser assholes were made out to be total assholes, and the total assholes were portrayed as non-assholes. People stopped watching and participating in the system, sensing that they were just being fed bullshit. The system became overrun by assholes who were working in the interest of other more prominent and more powerful assholes. Many people now operate professionally at the earliest stage of moral development. Professionals go along to get along, and those who step out of the box are punished. We are becoming a society of ordinary, unwise and comfortable assholes run by other bigger assholes. Demoralization of a society is a necessary step to get people to abandon universal law and be ruled by assholes. You can bet that in hell, there is a preponderance of assholes, and we are well on our way there. In stage 2, rules are recognized. Society must have laws to exist, and people should follow those laws for the good of humanity. This is called the conventional level of moral development, and moral development ceases at this point for most people. Many people pride themselves on following rules. In stage 3, the post-conventional stage, there is the recognition that no law can be truly universal. Universal principles should regulate written law. Few people reach this stage of abstract reasoning, which is required to understand both Christianity and the science of Western jurisprudence. Christianity has the disadvantage of low cognitive availability because it is about more than simple rule following, as with statutory religions. Raising consciousness above that required to live as a slave requires education in how to reason and think. All kings must surely recognize the threat of a well-educated group of slaves. Christian concepts such as original sin, the Trinity and grace have been deduced from logic and reason. They can be justified rather than merely accepted as another rule created by powerful and illustrious assholes. These concepts will all be explained in the following chapter. The Catholics not only played a vital role in the development of modern science, but also deduced these rational moral principles from the concept of universal law, as preached by Christ in the New Covenant, just as mathematicians created calculus from arithmetic and geometry. Assholes can often be suspected by the following actions. These actions should excite your asshole detectors. Rule 1. The protection racket. Assholes often promise safety. The protection racket is as old as the hills. If you are walking down the street on a hot day, and a man drives up to you on the sidewalk and offers you a free ice cream if you get into his van, getting in is probably not a good idea. Rule 2. Descriptive and prescriptive writing. There is descriptive and prescriptive writing. Goebbels, the propaganda minister for the Nazis, is often quoted as saying that if you repeat propaganda often enough, people will believe it. This is, in fact, true. He was being descriptive, not prescriptive. Philosophers such as Machiavelli, Rousseau and Nietzsche and others are sometimes labeled as assholes, by people who misrepresent them as being prescriptive. It's a form of bullshit designed to draw people away from reading. Nietzsche, Rousseau, Machiavelli and others have relevant things to say about these times. Assholes spread bullshit to kill curiosity. Philosophers being misrepresented by assholes to draw you away from them is nothing new. Kant has been the most extraordinary victim in all of this. Rule 3. The ego booster. We all like to be told we are great, and it's a real boost to our ego. Assholes are created when an asshole meets a non-asshole and showers them with compliments and admiration. This creates hubris, which is antithetical to wisdom. The hubris makes people fertile for the conversion and ripe for trusting other more prominent and more powerful assholes. A master bullshitter is always someone most people are going to like and trust. We usually think highly of those who think highly of ourselves. This method is probably the most popular technique of confidence men. It works very well on young people already infected with hubris, psychopathy or narcissism. Escape the mundane is the idea. Rule 4. The asshole and bullshit connection. When we hear bullshit, we should connect it to the asshole spreading it and stop listening to that asshole. This does occur in our day-to-day interactions. We don't generally like assholes or listen to them. Why can't we apply this simple logic to the political and propaganda state? It's the question of the century. Rule 5. Power corrupts, and people, like gases, expand to fill their containers. People with power must be contained. It's the original sin. We need money to have a society, law to have money, and people to write legislation, and administer, and enforce the law to have a forceful and fair effect. Skepticism and responsibility should apply to those in power rather than those who question it. The less we know about law, the more likely we are to be ruled by assholes. We must have a law known and enforced to have a peaceful society. Western jurisprudence is the best tool to contain assholes because Western jurisprudence is about universal law, which the asshole, by definition, is opposed to. Ethical systems have assholes in power for which there is no defense, because no one has a clear and objective definition of evil. Rule 6. Trust. A sometimes necessary evil, assholes often require trust to avoid accountability. Trust in reason itself, Christ himself, all others bring evidence. Trust is sometimes a necessary evil, but when it is being peddled as a virtue rather than a necessity, you can bet that you are dealing with an asshole. Trust is related to utilitarianism and the law of equity. Jeremy Bentham is often understood as a champion of these ideas, but he describes them as sometimes necessary evils rather than virtues in his writings. Ethical societies are based on trust. Juristic societies are based on contract. Authority and responsibility balance in a juristic society, by definition. A lack of balance creates assholes that require trust in ethical societies. Trust creates powerful and unaccountable assholes. The word asshole is a uniquely Western word because the West has a system of laws and of internal ethics that essentially follows universal law. The Western consciousness is essentially Christian, and Christianity gives us the universal law in written form so that it cannot be changed or restated to serve the needs of powerful assholes. For the most part, we treat others how we wish or expect to be treated in the West. The Western nations are where everyone wants to live. No one leaves a Western country to live in an ethical, or in other words, under a communist or ethical system of government. This written law of the New Covenant is the lawful basis of the Commonwealth, and it is similar in non-Commonwealth Western countries. The West adopted universal law as a principle to regulate lawmaking and create good laws that encourage and preserve human rights, leading to good commerce and high productivity. Most books, but not all, on jurisprudence explain that it's all based on Christianity, but people knew that back then. Few people write books to state the obvious. The Western system of law is the only system of law that forbids slavery because it is juristic and, therefore, universal, and is hence antithetical to assholes of all forms, including slave owners. Ethical systems are not universal by definition. Ethical systems can and do have slavery in one form or another. Christianity and universal law ended slavery in civilized countries, and very few Christians have ever been involved in slavery. Slavery is the business of those who follow purely statutory systems of law, ethical systems unregulated by the principle of universal law. As we lose the idea of universal law, we become overrun with assholes, as G.K. Chesterton explains in his book The Last Man. No one should want to be ruled by assholes, even if they think they are better connected to the assholes in power than everyone else, or even if they are one of the assholes themselves. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn explains in the Gulag Archipelago, anything can change under an ethical system. He was one of the assholes, and he ended up in the camps with many other former assholes. Kant, a Protestant, explains that Christianity is the best map of human consciousness, and Kant showed that we had moral knowledge a priori. That is, purely from reason itself prior to any experience. Experience shines a light in the mind to what is already there in reason. The West will soon lose Christianity and common law rule, simply because its people have been dumbed down with public education and media by assholes to the point of not being able to comprehend it, or understand its relationship with the law. This universal law is the best antidote to the asshole problem, and it is essentially the single commandment of the New Testament. It is the concept of Christian love. Statutory religions such as Judaism, Islam, atheism and feminism, as well as others, do not have this clear definition of evil. The modern selfism has only the advantage of simplicity, for a simple-minded and demoralized people ready to be ruled by assholes. Christianity, by a very long shot, has been the most persecuted religion throughout history. Assholes in power do not like Christianity, and the Christian yardstick for clearly identifying them. In Metaphysics of Morals, Kant states succinctly, no one would want to live in an ethical society, expecting his readers to understand him clearly. Christianity and Western jurisprudence remain the best cognitive tools from which to identify assholes, which is why they are both under attack by assholes in power, and the public educators who serve them. Public education seems to have the purpose of getting people to accept a society run by assholes. Corporations have an ethic, the courts are juristic, which regulate the assholes from corporations and keep them at bay. Corporations are ruled by sin, money and power. Their ethic is how they achieve those ends while remaining in good standing in the courts and public opinion. A juristic system keeps them honest, just so long as they are not allowed to be involved in government. Fascism occurs when corporations and governments unite. The visible left-wing movements of today are, in reality, a demoralized public demand for corporate fascism. Some believe in an ideal utopia that an ethical society can create. The rational and historical reality shows something entirely different. We can, however, live in a society that puts reins on assholes and bullshit rather than allow them to flourish. This is about as close to utopia as the original sin will permit. Original sin and the corruptibility of humanity is a hard fact, not something just made up by some powerful and illustrious asshole. It's the assholes of public education that have been teaching with whopping and grotesque lies of omission concerning history, ethics, and the nature of modern Western societies that allow us to forget the fundamental corruptibility of men. To be educated, we must educate ourselves and not depend on public education, the networks, and Hollywood. Books cannot be regulated so easily. They are easy to produce, and old ones are easy to find. A society that does not read and think cannot be free. Eternal vigilance, knowledge of the written word, and the use of the pen keep people free. The asshole problem. Chapter 2, Bullshit. This section continues on some of the ideas in the previous chapter, as well as shows some simple bullshit detection tools. The notion of assholes is necessarily connected to bullshit. I am going to restate the main point of the section on assholes and connect them to bullshit. We usually use conservative, liberal, left, right, communist, socialist, corporatist, and democratic to categorize political beliefs. Thinking of politics as ethical or juristic ideas is better, simpler, and more straightforward. Thinking in these terms can cut through a lot of bullshit. I explained 3 kinds of societies: ethical, juristic, and despotic. I showed why a purely ethical society requires assholes and bullshit to function, and a juristic society specifically rejects both assholes and bullshit when operating ideally. Despotic societies are lawless transitional states. The left tends to be ethical, while the right tends to be juristic. The left tends toward present and immediate empirical needs. In contrast, the right tends toward preserving natural law, which is time and place independent, and of Christ. Lucifer rules this world, and we compromise with the devil and our empirical needs to survive, to stay warm and fed at the very least. We are born sinners. You need both vectors, ethical and juristic, to form a political spectrum. The trick in our politics is to keep both sides happy. Countries have to feed their hungry and disadvantaged, defend their borders, and educate people, or the people will be robbed. Politics is about figuring out how to maintain a practical ethic and violate universal law as little as possible to keep the peace. In this way, we compromise with the devil, that is, we violate universal law to survive, and this usually takes the form of taxation. Christian logic built Western juristic societies, and its trinity manifests in the West's 3 branches of government. The hard reality of original sin creates 2 additional doctrines, the Trinity and grace, in an objective and reasoned universal law. The Trinity is 3 things, 3 ideas that reflect the nature of natural human consciousness and reality. Sophistical attacks on the Trinity are a perfect example of bullshit. There is much talk about the Trinity online, such as that one thing cannot be 3 at once, as if a fruit cannot be thick-skinned, sweet, and contain seeds. The Trinity is a vital concept of universal systems that reflects well-known and understood properties of the human mind. Understanding, reason and judgment form the faculties of the mind. Understanding leads you to food whenever you are hungry, while reason tells you to maybe not eat it. Judgment works between the 2, bridging the gap between reason and understanding. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of Western governments, respectively. The Holy Ghost is conscience, or the Creator's Spirit, and the executive branch is to not violate common or universal law in executing public policy. The responsibility lies with the executors of the statutes, not the makers. The legislative branch writes statutes to be understood and according to the needs of the people, and now the agendas of the international banks. It is the job of the judicial branch to reason out these new statutes, and pass them only if they do not violate the right of the people. The executive, being the conscience, is supposed to protect us from asshole laws in that execution must not violate the fundamental rights of people. The Trinity is manifested in the courts as the prosecutor, defense and jury, performing the functions of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. The prosecutor invokes a statute, or a law that the defendant did not stand under at the time of the crime. The defense cross-examines the prosecutors to be sure that nothing they are saying is bullshit, and that everything falls in line with reason. The jury acts as the conscience of the court, and is the final arbitrator of guilt or innocence and operates according to conscience in juristic systems. The judge is similar to a master of ceremony and ensures that proper procedure and rules of evidence are followed. In Marxist legal and lawfare courts, juries are instructed to go against their conscience and follow the judge's agenda-driven interpretation of the law. The Trinity is a necessary doctrine for fair and just lawful government because every man is by default a sinner, unless he is an actual saint, and the Trinity guards us from the corruption of centralized power. There is subtle reasoning behind the concept of grace, as well as ecclesiastical justification in Christianity. I will illustrate the reasoning with an example. Assholes are often sorry they ever became assholes. Imagine if you were walking across a field with dog shit all over the place. If you could never wipe your shoe, would you worry about stepping in it? Probably not, because you know you will eventually step in it anyway, and once you do, there is no way of getting it off. There is no point in trying. So you give up on trying, end up stepping in it, and tracking it all over the place. Assholism can be contagious. If you had a stick to clean your shoes, you would be more careful about where you stepped. If you are not a saint, you are a sinner, and at some or many points in your life, you will require a certain amount of grace. Forgiveness is a necessary part of a good society and a critical aspect of Christianity. Grace lets us wipe off our shoes and always try not to be assholes. Grace is the antidote for guilt and shame. It is necessary because the devil operates in guilt and shame. The expression, "Oh well, I'm going to hell anyway," makes you another asshole. The human experience comprises both reason and understanding in dialectical form, with aesthetics and morals bridging the gap between reason and understanding through acts of reflective judgment. For example, theft may be unlawful but necessary to save a life. Laws preserve life ideally, which is why we have them, but no law is perfect. Morality itself may force us to commit an unlawful act, as this law is written in an imperfect statutory form. In everyday life, at work or socially, we all have confidence in our ability to detect bullshit. We intuitively think those skills can be transferred to judging what we see and hear in the media. In reality, our minds turn off as soon as the television turns on. Television may even be putting us into a state of hypnosis. We forget that there are millions of dollars invested in creating an image and a story by people that we know are master bullshitters. Suppose it is possible to develop mathematical models to refine and perfect the art of bullshit. In that case, you can bet they are working on it or have done it. They may already have bullshit down to a hard science, but we can only use tools to identify it and think of it as an art rather than a hard science. People often think that organizations like the CIA are cloak and dagger operations. We imagine the Cold War and World War II stories from the assholes of Hollywood to create a mental conception of what these organizations do. In reality, they are the master bullshitters and control and filter what you see on the media as their primary function. They are the ones that mold and shape the minds of the populations by creating and controlling the bullshit spread by the networks and Hollywood. The rest of us, who don't want to be fooled, need to have well-developed abilities in the detection of bullshit. Imagine your walk through everyday life as one walking across a field, trying to avoid stepping into bullshit. We interact with people at work and play and believe we can detect it. Most people who spread bullshit aren't masters at it, and they don't have the knowledge gained from billions of dollars invested in finding ways to convert an odor to a fragrance and make bullshit look like a perfect facsimile of the true, the good and the beautiful, all in one steaming hot pile. The master bullshitters of the media make it ubiquitous in such a way that you walk across that field, you see piles, but you don't see the little invisible particles slowly collecting on your feet as you walk around the piles. Sometimes, you must stop and wipe off your shoe because you have collected enough to see it. People do not often look down at their shoes and assume it isn't there because they haven't seen them where they walked. Then, they sometimes think that the sound of galloping is a herd of zebras rather than horses. There are many examples of ridiculous ideas being planted into the subconscious minds of the public by the assholes of Hollywood and network news. The assholes of Hollywood create a subconscious attitude toward Christianity by making the worst of assholes in its movies to be visibly Christian, with Christian crosses tattooed on them, or in some jewelry representing the cross. This propaganda enters viewers' minds uncritically and repeatedly. Repetition, a simple, well-known, and well-used technique in the art of propaganda, forms an attitude in a viewer. Subsequent historical lies of omission reinforce that attitude, and people believe they have a justified opinion that is against Christianity and its juristic society. People think Christians are assholes, even though Christianity is the single antidote to the asshole problem. The demand for an ethical society must be due to the underlying negative view of juristic societies that have built up over time from movies and television shows made by the assholes of Hollywood and the networks. The assholes of network news use the term lawmakers in place of legislators. It's a subtle ploy. Legislation is written as statutes, not laws. They want you to forget the difference. If legislators were lawmakers, then they would have the right to mandate sex change operations for all of their citizens to enhance gender sensitivities. By shaping thought well enough, they may one day have this right given to them by the sleeping public as they awaken to the reality of a purely ethical system. According to Jacques Ellul, a famous French-Canadian sociologist who wrote the defining book on propaganda, well-educated people are not sometimes as good as ordinary people at detecting bullshit because they think they cannot be so easily fooled, and therefore have their guard down. Professionals and academics very often overestimate their abilities outside areas of their expertise. Everybody naturally underestimates their susceptibility to propaganda. Cognitive devices will tell you what you should or should not believe, not whether something is, in fact, true or false. We don't have time machines and cannot go back in history or to an event to see what actually happened. So we want to know objectively what we should and should not believe, not subjectively what we think happened. Cognitive devices keep us on an objective path. We have to filter out all the bullshit and remain objective before we try to figure out what happened or what the truth is. The trick here is to stay humble and objective during this process. Never confuse your own beliefs with facts. This is what lawyers do. They don't and shouldn't care if you're guilty because they cannot know. Their job is to expose the bullshit coming from the opposing side, something they can learn. They determine what should and should not be believed by exposing bullshit in a completely objective way. Objectivity is ensured with the adversarial system. Both sides want to win, and they do so by exposing the bullshit coming from the opposing side. All the bullshit gets exposed, and along with it, the asshole, in an ideal implementation of a perfect juristic system. You can say anything about lawyers, but you want winners on your side, and winners test the system. It turns out that with a few simple cognitive tools, you can filter out most bullshit you hear quickly and easily without doing piles of research. It's no surprise that it is easier to build a log cabin if you have an axe and a saw. In the same way, cognitive tools aid in thinking and make it easier and faster to filter bullshit from the truth. Most of the following rules come from jurisprudence. They help protect us from believing bullshit. Rule 1. The cross-examination. Cross-examination is the precursor to the modern scientific method. It is no surprise that a lawyer, Francis Bacon, came up with the idea of the scientific method. The scientific method can only be used to prove an idea is wrong. Suppose the idea can never be proven wrong. In that case, it is assumed correct as long as corporeal evidence supports the assertion. The scientific method is the physical science equivalent of the juristic method of cross-examination. It involves examining a stated physical principle through experimentation. The idea of the cross-examination is to examine the facts put forth by the other side and expose the bullshit, and see if any truth remains. It's the gold standard of proof initially brought to us by Roman jurists. Both sides in an adversarial system can cross-examine any evidence brought forth by the opposing side. Bullshitters have to live with the fact that piling it takes great effort while smelling it, almost none at all. The playing field is tipped in favor of truth. Bullshitters view this as unfair and therefore want to restrict debates and cross-examinations. Censorship is nothing more than the prevention of cross-examination. The word fact-checker is a new word for censor. What cannot withstand cross-examination should not be believed. Truth does not need the protection of censorship and welcomes cross-examination. Rule 2. Witness credibility. The cross-examined witness must have credibility to be a witness. Assholes are not allowed to testify, and the credibility of the witness is as important as the testimony. Assholes have a personal ethic that may not be compatible with them giving reliable testimony. Rule 3. Four corners. Closely related to this idea is a rule known as the Four Corners Rule. The meaning of this rule has changed in the last 100 or so years. Its original meaning is that if a document is submitted to court and it contains bullshit, then it is rejected from evidence in its entirety. Juristic courts categorically reject bullshit. Rule 4. Evidence. The rules of evidence require that physical evidence be connected to media and eyewitness testimony. It becomes evidence once there's physical evidence to connect this kind of thing to reality. During the attacks on 9/11, we saw aeroplanes being flown into buildings. The footage was repeated over and over again. Eyewitnesses spoke of seeing aeroplanes. There wasn't any physical evidence of aeroplanes colliding with the buildings or being involved in the 9/11 attacks in any way. Crashes like these would leave a preponderance of physical evidence, yet there was none. This should raise suspicion in anyone with reasonable judgment skills. Planes colliding with buildings should not be part of a narrative explaining what may have happened on September 11th. We should look for other explanations that do not involve aeroplanes. Much of the evidence was illegally destroyed immediately after the event. Evidence destruction is a well-known and well-understood crime. Both 9/11 and its media coverage were both brought to us by assholes. The events surrounding it form a great illustration of the power of modern media and its ability to manufacture bullshit, as well as the people's willingness to accept bullshit and listen to assholes without any critical thought. The same assholes who destroyed the evidence on 9/11 provided the official narrative. In this case, the word narrative is directly synonymous with the word bullshit. Assholes use persecution to make their point. The non-asshole has evidence and can therefore use persuasion. If persecution rather than persuasion is being used to make a point, then you can be sure that you are hearing bullshit. Rule 5. Zebras. An old proverb says that when you hear galloping, think horses, not zebras. Has a high rise ever before collapsed from a fire? Do the collapses of 9/11 look like the result of a controlled demolition? What is the most likely explanation? Occam's razor is often a good rule, but it isn't a law because sometimes the galloping sound is zebras, although this is clearly not the case for 9/11. Rule 6. Obligations. An essential aspect of the science of jurisprudence is the law of obligation. Bullshit is everywhere, and most of what we hear from those in almost any kind of network news or even alternative news is bullshit. We should always be skeptical of all media, at least as much as we are of any everyday person we meet. How are they funded? Where do their obligations lie? Network news is perfectly free to lie to you with no liability. The networks have no obligation to tell you the truth about anything. They cannot carry the obligation of not lying by omission because they cannot know everything. In an ethical system, the essential purpose of big media is to maintain the narrative that supports the agenda that dictates the ethic. If someone isn't obligated to tell you the truth, never assume they would. Doing so would involve a massive leap of faith. A faith in the honesty of the person you are listening to, and the assumption that their basic moral constitution is the same as yours. Authority and responsibility should always match for trust. You cannot trust anyone, as an authority, who does not take a form of lawful responsibility. Direct falsifiable claims are an indicator you are listening to a non-asshole. Falsifiable means they are worded clearly and can be easily cross-examined. Assholes use vague statements to blur lines of clarity and responsibility to avoid simple and effective cross-examinations. Rule 7. Big lies. If you are going to lie, make it a whopper. Small lies are questioned, but the big lies are often believed simply because of their magnitude. Size gives credibility. Tell a big enough lie, and most people will believe it. If the networks tell you that scientists say that if you don't get vaccinated, all the polar bears will melt, a smart thing to do is see if scientists say that. In many cases, you will find that they do not. Pundits bend and shape the media lens to get you to conclude what they want, as well as lie by commission by telling some real whoppers. A pundit on network news is not the same thing as a reporter. Rule 8. Lies of omission. An example is when they show you a picture of a polar bear swimming and neglect to tell you that polar bears both can and often do swim. They allow you to assume that polar bears are drowning from the melting ice, because most people have no idea that polar bears can and do swim great distances. It's a great way to target your emotions. Rule 9. Crowds are stupid. Crowds are dumber than people. Mark Twain once said, "Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect." People cease to be guided by their own will and logic in crowds. Crowds are tools for the assholes to manipulate and control. Rule 10. Hands and words. Do they behave as if what they say is true? The environmental movement always provides excellent examples of bullshit. You get people on the networks saying sea levels are rising, then buying beachfront property. You get expensive and wasteful solar and wind farms and electric cars. With that expense and waste, more CO2 is being put into the air than the equivalent energy from conventional combustion fuels. You must burn too much fuel to mine the materials to build expensive alternative energy devices and dispose of them to have anything close to a net decrease in carbon dioxide. This is well known to be accurate by at least an order of magnitude, by the Marxist theory of value. Fuel is cheap, portable and empowering to the masses. Rule 11. Statistical outliers. Everything happens daily in a country of 300 million people. It's what gets reported that shapes public opinion. A white cop shoots a black man, and it's news around the world. A white guy gets shot by a black cop, and no one hears about it. The choice of statistical outliers to shape public opinion is closely related to lies of omission. Stories are chosen to mold and shape opinion rather than by relevance. The news item in all the headlines may not be the most important thing happening. Statistical outliers are very often used and made to seem like everyday occurrences. If a Catholic priest gets caught abusing children, it's news around the world. Do people seriously not think this happens anywhere else, such as in mosques and synagogues? Are Catholics predisposed to this kind of behavior, or is the news just shaping our opinions so that we think of child molesters when we think of Catholic priests and Christianity? Are all Catholic clergy members child molesters? What about imams and rabbis? Why is it news when it's the Catholic Church? A reason could be that this is a violation of law in Christianity, so it's newsier than when it happens with the clergy of a purely statutory religion, where almost nothing is unlawful for kings and the assholes working under them. Rule 12. 2 ears, 1 mouth. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen to them long enough, and bullshitters often reveal themselves in their own contradictions. Restating words back to the speaker gets them to elaborate and possibly contradict themselves. Always think of yourself as an idiot, because that's what Socrates did. It saves other people the trouble of pointing it out when necessary, and saves you the possible humiliation. We usually know only a small fraction of what we think we know. A wise man listens to his opponents and asks questions. Good questions light the way to further enlightenment. Rule 13. Emotional arguments. It's well known that emotions often stand in the way of reason. Emotions such as fear can make us believe things that reason would not. People known as berserkers intentionally inject strong emotion whenever a truth they don't like is being exposed. Rule 14. One who believes bullshit is dumber than one who knows nothing. It may be the only absolute truth that has ever been spoken, and I have no idea who said it first. It's told in every language, throughout time, everywhere. It's a fundamental truth, and one to always remember before settling in too comfortably with any set of beliefs. It's always better to remain silent than to be wrong. These ideas and rules are intuitive, but we often need to remember we have them and apply them when listening to the media and politicians. These ideas are built into our minds since they are purely rational, and to be aware of and apply rational principles is to be illuminated. Illumination comes from within. It is good to be reminded of these principles as we shovel our way through a world that primarily runs on bullshit. So with the amount of information that is available, how can we be sure we have filtered out all the bullshit? We can never be sure we have done it, and we should never have too much confidence in our own views. Arguing with opposition exposes some bullshit that may have justified our own beliefs. Intelligent people are both able and unafraid to adjust their beliefs accordingly. You can quickly determine if some of your favorite news sources are good sources of information rather than assholes, and therefore filter out bullshit before you hear most of it using the likely incomplete list of tools and techniques listed above. Over time, you develop a short list of sources that you go to for information because you start knowing who the assholes are and do not waste time reading or listening to them. The key is to stop listening to these assholes once their bullshit has been exposed. Once a liar, always a liar is a good maxim of judgment that is well known, but not usually understood when people watch network news. It's essential to be skeptical of everything you hear in the media, even when you think there is no bullshit involved. Why do they call it a story? Just because a story is misleading doesn't mean that it is the product of a bullshitter. Even with the best and most well-intentioned journalists, the journalist must create a lens for the story to be told. What did the journalist think was important in the story? If you were there, would you agree? In this way, the media lens is created. The more you know about bullshit, the less time you will spend reading and listening to it. These simple rules can save many hours of research into a topic, only to find out that it's all bullshit, and you could have known that from the start. Some assholes want to end our adversarial system of laws. If this happens, it will no longer be possible to see a lot of the bullshit that we can expect in the top-down ethical rule of the world to come. The asshole problem. Chapter 3, Science and God. This chapter will apply the concepts of assholes, bullshit, juristic and ethical societies to describe a new type of ethical society, the scientific society. I am going to introduce two additional concepts, fact and right, to explain the essential retarded nature of any scientific society. Another way to explain this would be to say that the end justifies the means in a scientific or ethical society. You are the means, and the hopes and plans of the ruling class are the end. Might is right, and there are only slaves and slave owners in a purely ethical, materialistic society. In an ethical society, there will be few slave owners and many slaves. In a juristic Christian society, the end does not justify the means because right stands above fact. Its fundamental law of obligation prevents people from ever becoming slaves. The common law principle of mutual obligations guarantees the freedom people experience in a juristic society. Another expression for the science of jurisprudence is the study of right. Theologians provide the basis for this study. There can be no right without God. Right comes from moral agency, different from science and empirical survival instincts. Can moral agency be proved, or is it just a product of our imagination? The sage of Königsberg, Immanuel Kant, had a clear answer, which modern scholars call the reciprocity thesis. If you have moral feelings, then you have free will. If you have free will, you have moral feelings. The two are mutually inclusive. You can't have one without the other. Freedom and moral feeling lie outside the empirical reality of causal relations in the physical world and within the domain of scientists. This is the ground for having faith in a creator rather than in a scientific belief, which cannot describe ultimate reality, because morality lies outside the bounds of science. Science can never explain anything but cause and effect. As rational creatures, we have a discursive and finite intellect that prevents us from knowing the world as it truly is, as I will demonstrate in this chapter. Pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth exist outside anything that science can explain. Does God exist in nature? If God is in nature, then scientists will become the new priesthood. Mother Nature is a cruel and unforgiving bitch, and if you do not believe that, then wander out in the woods naked sometime. If the bears don't get you, the black flies and mosquitoes will. If they don't, the weather will. You cannot survive without society. We create societies to be safe from nature, and nature exists in understanding or fact. The moral agency exists in reason, or, in other words, in right. If God exists in nature, our society will become like nature, without consciousness of right. If we imagine having no free will, we will have no rights. No juristic component or concept of right exists in a purely ethical society. Laws cannot be written from wish or desire because wishes and desires can change. Ethical systems have no laws, only statutes. Wishes and desires are often created and maintained by the propaganda arm, in its various forms, by assholes in power in ethical societies. The child operates only by wishes and desires, and someone else steers his ship. Materialist philosophy is essential for a communist revolution, as a container is needed to boil water. The container contains the water, so you can apply heat and cook it. You cannot boil the water while it's in the lake, you must take it out and put it in a pot. Materialism contains the public mind, so it does not expand into the concept of right. Real science is not done by consensus. Science consists of falsifiable statements that can be disproven when wrong using the scientific method. An oligarchy rules a scientific consensus because scientists get paychecks, and no one disagrees with their paychecks. We in the West live in societies such that we could elect the hillside strangler, Ted Bundy, as our next leader, if the state had not already executed him. He was well liked by his neighbors and was very attractive to women. If he looked good on television and was treated well by the pundits, he could quickly become the leader of the free world. We have become a morally retarded society. How have we come to this point, and what does it have to do with science? How did we lose consciousness of right? Assholes of public education, mainstream media, and Hollywood have sold the public an understanding of science in that it is the only path to any ultimate truth, basically that God is in nature, or doesn't exist at all in any form. Science is sold to the public as an all-encompassing truth. Communism cannot persist if materialism is not the dominant religion of the population. Ethical brainwashing has resulted in convincing people that God exists within nature. The idea that God exists in nature is a dialectical error. By definition, God is outside nature, space and time, and explains morality. A new science is emerging, data science. It's a complex topic, but it suffices to state that the science we usually know is practiced using deterministic judgment based on laws we know. Science builds upon itself by discovering more laws. Data science is a form of reflective judgment that does not use the scientific method. It seeks to prove an assertion using statistics rather than to disprove one by experiment. It can be used as propaganda because a reflective judgment requires assumptions. An example of this would be the environmental movement, which assumed that carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere was the primary driver of world temperature. There are lies, damned lies, and statistics. The notion that science is based on truth is based on insinuated bullshit through lies of omission that allow the true nature and philosophy of science to remain hidden from most members of the public. Interesting aspects of science that contradict the grand narrative regarding science as an absolute and unconditioned truth remain hidden. People interpolate that science is pursuing an all-encompassing truth and that science will one day bring us the grand utopia. You get the wrong idea, which is the purpose of the lies of omission told by the assholes of science and the assholes of public education. Right, or the basic concept of universal law, is justified not by a subjective desire or convenience, but by the existence of a creator. Nothing creates something to see it destroyed. It's law for within from without that cannot be touched or corrupted by powerful assholes. Christ brings us the light of reason in universal law for peace on earth so that assholes do not destroy the creation of God. Auto mechanics can bullshit philosophers, and cooks can poison auto mechanics. We live in an organic society, and members of the public assume that the institutions, professionals, and organs surrounding them reflect their own natural morality. This is incredibly naive. Professionals and the intellectual class know about propaganda and narratives, but believe themselves discerning enough to see through all the bullshit, unlike everyone else. Professionals often assume the institutions operate as they do themselves in intention, universal law, honestly and without hypocrisy. In the West, this morality is well understood. It's why the term asshole has been such a well-used and understood term. Society and science are natural partners, they both have the same purpose. Gasoline and matches are natural partners. In both cases, the combination becomes far greater than the sum of the parts. Science seems to govern everything we see, hear, touch, smell, or taste. Rightfully so, almost always, people expect science to one day explain the nature of matter. To believe that science can one day explain all of reality is a different matter. This would be to think that reality is nothing more than a giant chemical reaction. There is no free will in a chemical reaction. Your next move depends only on your previous state. You are nothing more than the sum of your experiences. No freedom means no responsibility, and the idea of right becomes meaningless. There is no sin in a world defined by the dictates of physical science and the nature of matter. The ruling classes naturally expand their horizons to the boundaries of their container. If none exists, anything becomes possible. The protagonist in the first of the series of movies called The Hostel explains this as he is torturing a tied-up woman by burning her face with a blowtorch. Paraphrased, once you have been everywhere, seen everything and met everybody, what else is there? Boredom has often been known to be a playground for the devil. Ethics are usually the greatest good for the greatest number or something else, depending on the dictates of a particular economy, or just the hopes and dreams of the ruling class, justified by bought and paid for scientific consensus. No one can define greatest good. The ethic depends on what the ruling class have educated us about what is good in their networks and schools. The rulers are so far removed from the commoners that there is no concept of right in the laws governing the commoners. We are insects on a sidewalk. Commoners are only useful, they are discarded when they are no longer functional in the economy, as you would step on an insect or throw a machine in the trash. Original sin and the second law of thermodynamics describe reality, one reality in right, another in fact. They are not just doctrines created by powerful and illustrious assholes. All men are sinners in right, and in the physical world, in fact, everything falls apart, from the paint on a fence to a bird's nest or a train, as the second law of thermodynamics, or the scientific law of entropy, dictates. Ethical rulers always struggle for more power, created by the imbalance of responsibility with authority. They require trust and licentiousness, as they struggle for a temporary order, and society slowly falls apart from corruption. More corruption and lies are always needed to hide or fix previous corruption and lies. Lies multiply like rabbits and debt to private banks balloons. A person bleeding to death and bleeding out while running for a bandage is the perfect metaphor for a country that has an interest-bearing currency created in the hands of privately owned banks, as more money is borrowed to pay the ballooning debt. The government is on the hook of the international banks. I know an old lady who swallowed a lie. I don't know why she swallowed the lie. I guess she'll die. Privately owned money created by and for private interests is this lie. See The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin, or Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. Physical scientists have their second law of thermodynamics, which tells us everything falls apart with time. Christians have original sin and subsequent corruption of men and their institutions. Philosophers speak of the true, the good and the beautiful to describe reality. Engineers and scientists only consider the world composed of particles and energy described by math. Lawyers think in terms of both fact and right. Fact and right mean the same thing as the terms the true and the good that philosophers use. This chapter is on the true and the good. The following chapter will deal with the beautiful in the context of an assault on the true, the good and the beautiful we are experiencing. Suppose you are in court charged with car theft. In that case, you must have the car in your factual possession and not have the right to it provided by some previous agreement between yourself and the automobile's owner. Plaintiffs must prove both relevant facts and that right was violated. Both fact and right are required for truth in law. Juristic societies operate according to the preservation of right and allow people to operate in fact freely to create and run the private economy, provided laws of right are not violated. Right is king in a juristic society. Lucifer still has a place in empirical needs and desires, but is in chains if the end never justifies the means. Juristic societies are called lawful societies, where the end does not justify the means. Only, in fact, does the end justify the means. Fact is the empirical reality of space and time, the people, the economy, and the state. The concept of right is space-time independent. Our laws and institutions are expected to operate, in fact, within boundaries set by right. So the end does not justify the means. In right, nothing changes under the sun. In fact, everything is in a constant state of flux. No material or economic benefit can justify the breaking of right in a juristic society. In a society based only on fact, the right of self cannot exist. Privilege takes the place of right. Ordinary people bear responsibility, while a ruling class enjoys the authority and has all the right. The unconscious machine can't guarantee anything, you are merely one of its parts. When your part goes out of date, in purely scientific terms, there is no justification for keeping you around. There is no law to protect your existence, or that places the soul above matter. An ordinary man, who loses a child to an oligarch in need of a new heart, may not even view that oligarch as an asshole, thinking that he would have done the same thing if the tables had been turned. This is what I mean by a society of assholes. Assholes expect other people to be assholes. Mythical hell has people being thrown into pits of fire by devils with pitchforks as a metaphor. The real hell is just assholes surrounded by other assholes. Kant describes this reality in terms of fact and right in all of his works. In the science of jurisprudence, truth, he explains, comprises both fact and right, quid juris and quid facti. His is and ought conceptions mean the same thing and are natural to our human consciousness. The ancient atomists are re-emerging, and they are the assholes of science. They believe that there is no creator, and that science will one day describe all aspects of reality. This divides human consciousness in half, leaving only the faculty of understanding, no reason, and, therefore, no capacity to make moral judgments. It is no wonder we don't mind the wars and foreign occupations. This belief requires faith in a matter that, in reality, is more contrary to common sense and experience than faith in a transcendent creator. Consciousness is bound in the world of the vulgar, only empirical needs are met. Taste, right, beauty, grace and virtue become shadows of the past. Whether one believes that ultimate truth is in God or matter is strictly a matter of faith. Believing in the existence of atoms and all of their spinning particles is an act of faith. No one knows what a gravitational or electromagnetic field is, they are only known by their effect. A creator is inferred because we are conscious and self-aware, something the purely cause and effect material world can never explain. Who were God's parents? What is an electron made of? What happened before the universe started? How big is it? Can it be infinite? What lies beyond if it is finite? These are all questions that reason sometimes thinks it can answer. In reality, reason and understanding can only be exercised within the limits of experience. Beyond experience, reason becomes speculation or faith. Our expertise will always be limited, but reason demands an unconditioned truth. To go beyond experience in a search for an unconditioned truth is to have faith. This is the essential message of Kant's critique of pure reason. The scientific method and a cause and effect world have no concept of right, so the question of right doesn't belong there. How much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? Woodchucks don't chuck wood. It is a dialectical error to suppose that scientific methods could be transferable to the study of right. When Christ said there is nothing new under the sun, he referred to right, and he only spoke of right, being not of this world. Christ is transcendent. Consider the paradox of faith in the machine of science, where one must grapple with the notion of free will as a mere illusion. Can you imagine yourself as conscious or self-aware, and still hold this belief? The rulers, it seems, perceive you as soulless, a mere tool for their ends. There is no reason for self-awareness or consciousness to exist in a purely cause and effect scientific universe. There is no reason to believe anything. You can be ruled only by your material wishes, instincts, and those who create and provide for them. Kant described two philosophers searching for an all-encompassing truth, as one philosopher milking a he-goat, while the other holds a sieve underneath. A perfectly straight line, or an ideal world, are only products of a rational space outside physical reality. Physical effects such as diffraction and gravity prevent a perfectly straight line from ever coming into existence. Original sin prevents the ideal society, utopia, from becoming a possibility. Let's delve into pure ideas, such as the straight line and the perfectly good man. These ideas, existing outside the realm of observation, can be used to shape laws in right, both in terms of math and law. They remain uncorrupted by specific observations, serving as yardsticks to measure truth. Consider the notion that to know, one must have a foundation of knowledge. The very bedrock of this knowledge is faith. The side of God, inherently unprovable empirically, and the side of science, disprovable rationally, form the basis of our understanding. In the following pages, I will demonstrate how science can undermine its own credibility. The evidence for gravity is that an object falls every time you let go of it. No one knows what gravity is. The idea that two masses can attract with nothing detectable connecting them tests the limits of natural reason. It sounds unbelievable, but it is truth, and an accepted fundamental law of science everywhere and all the time. We only experience it in terms of its effect. The evidence for the existence of God is simply that God-fearing societies based on God's laws prosper, and societies based on matter and science never last and depend on theft and murder. Materialists want to explain the world in the context of matter and energy, and physics is the study of matter and energy. Everything in the physical world is composed of matter and energy. Ultimately, all physical science-related disciplines and their laws, from biology to civil engineering, must obey the laws of physics. If science explains an ultimate material reality, it will be described in physics. Biologists cannot have laws that violate the rules of chemistry, chemists cannot have laws that violate physics, and physics cannot violate the rules of mathematics. This interconnectedness of scientific disciplines underscores the importance and relevance of physics in our understanding of the world. Physics is based on observation and the idea that matter is composed of atoms. Atoms consist of tiny particles held in orbit by an invisible, an unknowable force field that attracts these particles to another mass of particles in the center. These moving charges create electromagnetic waves that can be detected using scientific instruments. We see and detect atoms by these waves with scientific instruments. In reality, the idea of the atom and its spinning particles is not a direct observation, but a product of our creative imagination. This shows the power of our minds to simplify and express what is observed and how models can be used to predict the behavior of matter and energy. No one has a real picture of an actual atom, but we can imagine it and understand its properties. The particles we imagine are products of the experience brought by our sensory perceptions operating in our sensual world of Newtonian physics. We have experienced charge as static electricity and have lots of experience with force and mass. To explain the nature of the atomic model, imagine you have been locked in a cage all your life and have three objects in the cage with you: a rubber ball, a coin, and a piece of paper. Any other object, such as a bird, an ice cube, or a train, would be utterly foreign to you. You are learning science in that cage, and a teacher hands you a closed-opaque box with an object inside, a classic teaching device in science. You are asked to conduct experiments to determine what is inside the box. You shake it around and feel how the object bounces in the box. It's too heavy to be a piece of paper, and it doesn't roll around, so it can't be the rubber ball, so it has to be the coin. Using the scientific method, you conclude that it must be a coin in the box, because the coin explains all the observable evidence. No evidence contradicts the coin hypothesis. No experiment can be conducted showing that it isn't a coin in the box. The scientific method confirms the coin hypothesis and creates a scientific fact. The scientific method is like a cross-examination in a court of law. The prosecutor tries to show that the defendant is lying by asking questions that could disprove his testimony. In the same way, science is discovered by scientists trying to disprove hypotheses until they find one that cannot be disproven. Suppose there is no real coin inside the box, but a mechanical washer. The idea that there is a coin will never contradict anything observed about the box, and the box always feels like a coin is inside. You know you can let the box get wet and that the coin inside will attract a magnet. Those two observations do not apply to the other two objects, the rubber ball and the piece of paper. The coin in the box model works. Engineers use this idea to build machines and objects from the boxes containing the coin. These boxes always have consistent properties that the engineers depend on for their machines to work. No one is any wiser or closer to the truth. The box can be used because it has predictable and known properties. The engineers and economists don't care what is in the box, they only care that the model works. Only theologians and physicists care about what is in the box. There is no economic motivation to determine what is in the box. The economic effort involved in making things from these boxes serves only to make society comfortable and safe. The Christian theologians want truth, just like the physicists, but for different reasons, one to establish fact and the other to establish right. Let's poke fun at the queen of all sciences, mathematics. Does everything always add up in math? In the following, I will explain Kant's primary hypothesis regarding the nature of observable truth. This and the following chapter rely on Kantian philosophy. Below is proof of the transcendental aesthetic, the first section, and most important of the famous and world-changing critique of pure reason. This proof wasn't around in Kant's time. I learned it from qualified people. In this chapter, we have examined the good, that is, free will, shown by the above reciprocity thesis. We will explore the metaphysical truth of empirical experience in Kantian terms. Physicists study the behavior of matter in time and space, and it is the study of matter and energy, by definition. Philosophers can examine time and space, independent of matter and energy, to explain the following mathematical paradox, and gain a glimpse into what we can or cannot know about ultimate reality. Gabriel's horn is a well-known problem every first-year student likely sees in calculus class. It consists of a horn with a diameter of 1 meter at its opening. A meter down the throat, the diameter reduces to 1/2 of a meter. At 2 meters, the diameter is 1/3 of a meter, and so on until infinity. The rule is that the diameter of the horn gradually and continually decreases, as a rule, 1/x, on an axis that runs down its center. The horn gets narrower and narrower and never ends. The horn can be scaled any linear way, and the result will still hold. Calculus is the math of rates of change, and calculus allows us to work out the exact area of irregularly shaped objects, objects other than simple objects like cylinders, spheres and cubes. The student is asked to calculate this surface area, and the surprising answer is that it is infinite. This means that if you ever attempted to paint this horn, you would need an endless supply of paint. No matter how much paint you had or how thinly you applied it, the job could never be finished. The student is then asked to calculate the volume of paint that could be contained inside the horn, and the answer is 2/pi as a fraction. If you had 2 over pi cubic meters of paint, a little less than 2/3, you could fill the entire horn with paint. Then, you could pour it out and leave the inside surface covered with leftover paint stuck inside the horn. Here's where it gets interesting. One student could argue that you need an infinite amount of paint, while the other insists it is less than 2 over pi cubic meters. So, who is right? They both are. This is a paradox, a mathematical puzzle that defies logic and cannot be resolved. So, the world of math doesn't always add up for objects that exist in space. There is a glitch in the matrix. Let's delve into a philosophical question. Do we perceive space? The answer is more complex than it seems. In reality, we can only perceive or understand space when an object exists. It is nothing without the object. We live in a causal universe where energy causes motion in an object. We perceive time by observing the interactions of objects, such as the time it takes you to get home from work, the time it takes a clock to tick, or the time it takes to boil a pot of water. Without objects, we cannot perceive time or space. Time and space are not things in themselves, unlike the objects inside them. They are modes of perception, or a priori intuitions. Before we can experience an object, we must have an a priori intuition of space and time. Our intuitions of space and time, combined with reason, tell us that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and circles and triangles all have specific mathematical properties. This could never be learned by experience. Could these a priori intuitions match reality, given that we must have them before we can experience reality? Does the world truly exist as we see it, as science sees it? No one can answer this, and the safe bet is the answer, no. The matrix is a real thing, we know, because it has at least one glitch. Similarly to a straight line, fairness when dealing with others is also a priori. The concept is required for a moral experience. If you have 2 children, give one 2 candies and the other only one. The crying and screaming will be about the concept of fairness. Science works because it creates wealth and comfort. It can never be about absolute truth or fairness. It pays, and no one wants to be without it. It has nothing to do with finding unconditioned or absolute truth. It is part of the sinful material world of Lucifer, or Mother Nature, the one with which we must compromise to live. In our modern Western world, corporations are the ones that lead the way in science. Corporations and unaccountable non-government organizations, NGOs, influence both academic sciences, as taught in universities, and that which is taught to the general public by the assholes of television networks. Corporations are profit-making systems. You put money into a system comprised of economists, engineers, and workers. If more money comes out than goes in, the corporation pleases the shareholders and is believed to be a good thing. Science becomes just another form of money. Ultimately, it's all managed by unconscious shareholders, who watch trends and lines from comfortable chairs in front of their computers. Science, the world of facts, creates a world where the end justifies the means, you are the means, powerful assholes determine the ends, and might is right. As long as people are safe and comfortable, they care little about anything else. They do not care who dictates reality, they do not care where the ship is headed so long as they are warm, comfortable, and have enough to eat. People live in the moment. Live in the moment, forget about all of this, your history, and how you got to where you are. Long-term thinking oligarchical families know this, and our lack of a long-term worldview gets used against us. It's all been deliberate and designed this way by the oligarchy, which has now almost completely dismantled and destroyed the juristic societies of the West. The rich want an ethical society, and reality is created with their tools, the assholes of media, education, and entertainment. This is Marxism, and the first tenet of the Communist Manifesto is a publicly owned central bank and the absolute power it provides for an oligarchy. The central control of the public bank makes it, in fact, privately owned, words as weapons. Did the assholes of science force us to this point? We went willingly. It was an easy path and a comfortable path. The left and right political parties are simple. The left wishes to eliminate the right of man and make him a tool for the ruling classes. The modern right measures one's contribution to society entirely in dollars. You are what you do. Modern right-wing Christians are, in reality, no more Christian than the devil himself. Both are much too smart to have to investigate or listen to ideas that run contrary to their own beliefs. Most of what everyone knows about science, which is almost nothing, in religion, of which people are ignorant, comes from these assholes of which I speak, and come in the form of lies of omission. I'm reminded of the Supertramp song, Child of Vision, which has the line, "You watch the television because it tells you that you should." Somehow the historical and scientific documentaries created by the networks and Hollywood convince people that they are intelligent for watching them. Popular history contains gigantic, sick, and grotesque lies of omission. In science, they somehow convince people, or allow them to believe, that science will one day give us an all-encompassing or complete truth. There are many science shows on mainstream media, but few deal with interesting, profound, or real moral dilemmas or issues of law, and the networks largely determine our consciousness. The assholes of science retard perception, make us unconscious of right to make us lawful slaves to a ruling class through a simple loss of agency at law. The rich are different because they see the world differently. Intelligence is thinking critically, recognizing patterns, and using them to make sound judgments. Intelligent people apply a method of cross-examination and the scientific method to things they hear from our rulers and the powerful and illustrious assholes that manage and create opinions. Intelligence, courage and truth-seeking, and not acquiescence, get us closer to the truth in things. The asshole problem. Chapter 4, The Total Asshole. I now need to expand and develop the idea of the asshole from the first chapter of the book on this topic. To look at Karl Marx, we first need to take a closer look at the term asshole, because Karl Marx was no ordinary kind of asshole. A new word or definition, the total asshole, needs to be defined, clarified and explained. Usually, in life, we all meet assholes as part of our day-to-day experiences. You see an insult directed to you from a stupid asshole online. Or maybe you suspect your coworker is peeing in your coffee in the office while he says it's a new brand. These are the day-to-day kind of assholes, and they are essentially the same as the assholes that you hear about on the news. The only difference between them is in magnitude. In every respect, these are ordinary assholes that are assholes simply because they believe a different set of rules apply to them. Ordinary assholes can be as assholish as narcissists or psychopaths, or be someone who butts in front of you. An ordinary asshole could be a boss who berates you in front of colleagues, but always gives you a good raise and good evaluations. A categorical asshole may be one to you in every sense, but may have other friends or people he likes. He doesn't like you. So, someone that you perceive as one in every possible sense could be termed a categorical asshole. If someone is lying or mean to everyone all the time, we could openly refer to them as categorical assholes, and everyone would know what we meant. Still, there are ways of avoiding or dealing with these assholes. In discussing Karl Marx, I can't say what kind of person he was because I had never met him. Lots of people say lots of things, but unless their hypothesis can be tested, their statements are nothing more than hypothetical or esoteric. Marx will only be judged by his ideas here. I want to digress a little into standards of truth now, so that the standard of truth that will be obtained for the assertion that Karl Marx was a total asshole can be appreciated. If a hypothesis can be justified, it becomes esoteric rather than hypothetical. This requires some reason to believe the hypothesis is true. I could say that aliens abducted me yesterday, and I wrote this script while sitting on Jupiter. Witness accounts without physical evidence mean nothing unless the Sasquatch and flying saucers exist, the Earth is flat, and aeroplanes were flown into those buildings on 9/11. In the case of 9/11, Imagine if you were planning a building for a textbook example of a perfectly executed controlled demolition. During the demolition, someone suggests flying an aeroplane into the building by remote control before you set off the charges. The idea would be absurd. There is no physical evidence of planes having been flown into the buildings, and no engines or landing gear were ever found in the rubble at any crash sites. Although there were witnesses, we can reasonably suspect that no planes would have been flown into buildings on 9/11 based on the lack of physical evidence. Witnesses can be paid, and their witnessing often sounded rehearsed. The 9/11 no-planer, controlled demolition conspiracy theorists are nearly apodeictic in their certainty that any contradiction in either of the 2 points would be absurd. Science has confirmed the controlled demolition hypothesis. No event other than controlled demolition could account for the observations without sounding ridiculous. Truth in fact. There would be no reason for planes to crash into the buildings, and doing so would be absurd and likely counterproductive. Truth in right. To the highest possible standard of truth, we can assert that 9/11 was a controlled demolition and that no planes were involved. The only higher standards of truth are in math and the science of jurisprudence, because they are both purely rational and have no observational aspect, only truth in right. Observable or empirical evidence is truth in fact, and rational truth is truth in right. Both are required for a good standard of truth. The idea that only universal law can lead to universal peace is a truth in right. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, also true in right. These are both a priori intuitions, necessarily a priori to any physical or moral experience. These are higher standards of truth than those in the above 9/11 conspiracy theory, but only because they are purely rational truths and do not depend on observation. In showing that Karl Marx was a total asshole, it is possible to meet this very high 9/11 conspiracy theory standard of truth. It may be possible to convict someone of murder. Still, a verdict of innocence is usually impossible, so the accused is said to be not guilty, which is not the same as innocence. He wouldn't be in court if the accusation were impossible, so an absolute truth in a verdict, in fact, would be impossible. The standard of truth behind the statement that Marx was a total asshole is higher than the murder conviction standard, but just slightly lower than that required for mathematical theorems, and about equal to the standard of truth met by the above 9/11 conspiracy theory. But in right rather than in fact. Philosophers can only be assholes in right because they aren't involved in the operation of the state or anything else for that matter. The followers of Marx's ideals always become total assholes in fact. A total asshole, in the philosophical sense, would be a philosopher who is at odds with all of the 3 domains of philosophy, that is, the true, the good, and the beautiful, with the additional requirement that he cannot be avoided. Suppose the philosophy of Karl Marx can be proven to be entirely antithetical to the true, the good, and the beautiful. In that case, we may be tempted to use the term categorical asshole. The term total asshole is more appropriate for the following reason. It may be that you are not interested in Karl Marx, but he was certainly interested in you, and this cannot be said about the categorical assholes described earlier. Categorical assholes can be avoided. However, we are all affected by this particular type of asshole, the total asshole. I will prove, not merely illustrate or suggest, that Karl Marx was a total asshole. To justify this, I must prove that Marx had mens rea, the purposeful and inventive mind to destroy the true, the good and the beautiful. His ideas are fundamentally and obviously defective. The wealthy and influential champions of Marxist ideas are disciples for entirely different reasons than the young and naive. By the term Karl Marx, I will be referring to the Marxist agenda and the wealthy and powerful ordinary assholes backing it, the total assholes driving it, as well as the innocent groupies. This agenda in its modern form is often referred to as cultural Marxism, or simply corporate communism, or corporate fascism. It's an agenda of wealthy and powerful assholes sold to the soft, thick and empty skulls of young people who do not have a life experience from which to make sound judgments. To show that Marx was a total asshole, I will have to show that he meets the requirements in all of the philosophical domains. By this, I mean that he is intentionally bullshitting you, and that his ideas can be shown to be sophistical rather than truthful in philosophy, harmful rather than good in reality, and antithetical to sanity. Most of this will be new, so I will carefully explain everything. Marxists have been the greatest purveyors of both hate and hate crimes ever seen in history. In terms of fact, Marxists have been the purveyors of hate crimes in the form of both torture and genocide in a way that dwarfs anything Hollywood has ever shown on any war in any movie to mere insignificance. In terms of right, they have been the purveyors of the greatest hate crimes. For most of World War II, the Americans and British merely annoyed Germany. The war was mainly between the Germans and the Russians. In the Russian-German War of World War II, as Russian Bolsheviks made their way across Western Europe toward Germany, they committed the most grotesque, obscene and cruel hate crimes in all of history. Tens of millions of Christians were raped to death, tortured to death, buried alive or burned alive in their churches. Some were nailed to the sides of buildings while still alive after being raped nearly to death, and women had their breasts cut off prior. Women threw themselves in front of trains to avoid the coming Bolshevik onslaught. The onslaught was both wholesale and retail. Individuals were raped hundreds of times, groups were burned alive in their churches. It's never been on TV or presented by Hollywood. I do not wish to write pages describing the absolute sickest and cruelest of tortures beyond the imagination of average, healthy minds. You can find this information on alternative platforms or read about the Bolshevik Revolution in mainstream history books. None of it is contested. It is just ignored by all the assholes that form and shape thoughts, emotions and opinions of the general public, who has little time to seriously investigate history. Bolshevik sickness was well known to the Allies, but they were in the fight with the greatest possible opponent, those who wanted freedom, sovereignty and national banks. The Nazis were never trying to impose a world government, they opposed the world government you see enveloping you today. Jews, Muslims and blacks fought on the side of Hitler. He wanted them to have national pride and, with it, freedom. This is why Hitler has been made into a monster by the networks, Hollywood and public education. Germany didn't start the war, Poland did with the Danzig massacre of Germans. Germany fought the Bolsheviks, who would otherwise have enveloped all of Europe. As Anthony Sutton explains in his book Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks were financed by American banks on Wall Street and trained in New York City. But this never made the papers, or the nightly news. Big finance and big capital are usually Marxist because Marxism leads to a purely ethical society, where only might is right forms the basis of law, giving the kings all the freedom and the subjects all responsibility. In terms of rights, the greatest hate crime ever committed was to accuse a people of mass genocide and categorically deny them the right of cross-examination of their accusers. The Nuremberg trials charged 137 German officers with crimes of genocide. It was a wartime tribunal, not a court of law as seen in shows from Hollywood and the networks. The defense was not permitted to bring evidence not approved by the prosecution. Of the 137 officers that were charged, only 2 finished the trials with their gonads intact. See Zundel trial of 1985 transcript. The Bolsheviks were never charged or exposed, and the Nazis were labeled as absolute evil and denied the right of cross-examination of their accusers. The jaw-dropping hypocrisy and complete inversion of logic can only be explained if the Bolsheviks were in power. Only then could such truths be eliminated from public consciousness, or could such hypocrisy be so blatant yet invisible. This was Alexander Solzhenitsyn's conclusion. Some readers may conclude that I used Marx instead of the word Jew. This is not the case because many Jews are anti-Marxists, many Arabs, Christians, atheists, feminists, as well as others, are Marxists. The philosophy, however, is a restatement of Judaism. Marxists do not, however, hate everything. They have a love of promises. Usually, we think of the three great promises in an old Hollywood movie: to live and die in LA. The promises are, I love you, the check is in the mail, and one other. Marxists add a fourth to these great promises: the promise of a grand utopia, where nothing bad ever happens after the agenda has run its course, capitalism is eliminated, and they control everything directly. Now, onto my proof of the Marxist assault on the true, the good, and the beautiful. The deception is deliberate because it is obvious. Marxists will own and control all means of production, and with this, a better world will be. It doesn't make sense, and it can't work. It is defective in right, and nonsense in fact for the following reasons. Every chewing gum wrapper that floats across the sidewalk in the wind, every piece of real estate, every object put out to the curb for garbage collection, and everything else in between that is man-made and under the sun must be owned by someone. In right, the concept of ownership is a foundational concept of principled rational law, or juristic systems of law. Someone must be responsible for carrying the obligation to ensure that an object or property, such as a horse or a ray gun, doesn't cause harm or injury to a person or the property of others. If there is an obligation, there must also be authority to meet it. Ownership can only provide that authority. If implemented, Marxism would necessitate the relinquishment of property rights, resulting in a transfer of all property ownership to the state. This would grant them absolute authority over the economy, with the population responsible for its operation. The potential consequences include bread lines, restricted travel, and the imposition of vaccines and digital IDs. The inherent imbalance between authority and responsibility in Marxism is not just a theoretical flaw, but a fundamental injustice. This concept is easy for even a toddler to understand, highlighting the glaring unfairness of a system that places all authority in the hands of a few while the masses bear the responsibility. In the language of lawyers, Marxism can be considered defective in law because it is faulty in right. In fact, the subject becomes the economy, operated by those who own the means of production. Only they have the necessary authority. Centralized control of an extensive complex system presents problems that cannot be solved under the current state of development in applied mathematics. Anyone understands this limitation after only 2 or 3 years of study in an undergraduate degree program in some discipline involving systems such as machines, circuits, or the economy. Unlike the rest of the rapidly expanding field of math, mathematicians have struggled with this limitation for over 100 years, with very little progress. On the other hand, engineers are fortunate, as their systems are relatively simple, consisting of a few components that operate directly and uncomplicatedly. They can use equations to describe the functioning of most basic systems, from household appliances like hair dryers and toasters to complex fly-by-wire control systems guiding combat jets and drones. These systems are elementary when we compare them to the economy. In machines, most of the time, if you put twice as much energy into the machine, it will go about twice as fast, pump twice as much water, or make your toast in about half the time. All the little bits inside these machines operate close to an ideal and simple way. However, controlling complex multivariate systems, such as drones and fighter jets, is a different story. These systems, operating under extreme conditions, require high-speed specialized computers and intricate programming due to the non-ideal behavior of most of their components. Controlling these systems involves solving complex equations, a computationally intensive task requiring a certain level of artistry. The most cutting-edge systems may have 10 or 20 control variables. They give us amazing things: the vertical landings of rockets, drones, and kids' hoverboards. When they go wrong, as they often do, fast military jets crash, and rockets explode. They demonstrate the limits of modern control capabilities, which are less than 10 or 20 control variables. They require a lot of art and computational effort using specialized computer architectures, unlike the chip that is the center of a smartphone or PC. An economy has a much larger set of variables that are often more interdependent than those inside a machine and with less ideal behavior. Interdependent variables run in thousands rather than only in the tens in the case of a complex machine. A war in the Middle East and its effect on fuel costs could affect your ability to ship apples. Regarding energy, if you can buy 100 apples for $25, you must pay about $1 if you only want one. The energy you put in is not proportional to the output. In one instance, an apple costs $1, in the other, 25 cents. The price of the apple is not directly proportional to the number you buy. Ideally, one apple should cost 25 cents if you can buy 100 for $25. The various parts of an economic machine do not behave in an ideal way, as they do with actual machines in engineering. A system with less than ideal behavior and a much larger set of control variables cannot be controlled centrally because no one has math skills. In matrix math parlance, the economic matrix must be simplified and partitioned. This action results in the loss of freedom for people inside the economy by simplifying the matrix by eliminating variables. You must be more controllable and predictable so the economy can be controlled. You get squeezed into this matrix, and some variables about freedom must be erased. Greed and power, rather than beauty, respect, right, and truth, become our highest ideals, making us more predictable and easily managed. If we picture a Marxist economy operating as a machine, imagine a car going down the highway with the trunk open, the hood being torn off by the wind, and a hubcap rolling into someone's front window as the car heads toward a tree. People inside the car fight, yell and scream to restore a balance between authority and responsibility as the car heads toward doom. Perhaps a better description would have an asshole intentionally driving the car toward a cliff as various parts of the car fly off along the way. One of the passengers is listening to the news on the radio, another is smoking a joint, and the third is playing a game on his cell phone. People often discuss chaos theory. Another way to discuss this would be by using words involving limitations in what can be done with mathematics and systems. Marxism is and always has been a disaster, in fact, and it is a nightmare in right. Earlier in the book, I said that Marxist ideas would be shown to be sophistical rather than truthful in philosophy, harmful rather than good in reality, and antithetical to sanity. It is sophistical rather than truthful in philosophy because it is defective in right in its inherent inability to balance responsibility with authority. It is defective in the domain of the good. Fairness is a distant dream in the harsh reality of a Marxist economy. Those in authority hoard wealth, while the people bear the burden of the flawed economy. Corruption builds on corruption to keep the system running, the money flowing, and the bullets flying in the right direction. They keep borrowing more money for the people to pay back while wars keep the machine running. Banks, rather than churches, have the tallest buildings in cities. This is harmful rather than good in reality. In stark contrast, an economy cannot thrive under a central control. Only through the nodes of free enterprise, where responsibility and authority find a delicate balance, can individuals maintain their sanity and keep food on the shelves, trains running, and gas at the pumps. In terms of the beautiful, Marxism is a direct assault on sanity, not in the sense that it is directly responsible for the rise of mental illness and narcissism, but in another sense, its conception of what is beautiful. Freedom is part of sanity, which is the doctrine of the West, and to understand the idea of freedom, one must go beyond the vulgar, which only satisfies everyday needs and empirical desires. One can walk through a modern art gallery and witness the prevalence of abstract, pointless, and often ugly and stupid art. The most unappealing paintings can fetch exorbitant prices. The buildings in major cities are all uniform, square, efficient, and devoid of aesthetic value. Only in their occasionally staggering size can we find a hint of the sublime. The first time we hear rock and roll music, it is repulsive, but after hearing it long enough, we learn to love it. I learned to love it from hearing Three Dog Night and Neil Diamond on my parents' stereo as a child. My first record was Kiss Destroyer, an album depicting the band members celebrating and partying in hell on the cover. Rock and roll songs are about the vulgar and get us there through emotion. They help us appreciate empirical and subjective pleasures in life. If all that mattered in life was to get laid, party, and be in love all the time, these songs could be viewed as high art and in good taste. I remember listening to rock bands often. Other kids liked it, but none of the adults did. A rock concert is a spectacle. You get the sublime and surreal experience of a crowd of a size beyond comprehension. We can all do arithmetic. This comes from the faculty of reason, but imagination cannot conceptualize the size of the crowds. It scares us from a safe distance yet amazes us, because imagination can't comprehend it. Reason demands that it do so. This is a sublime experience, part of the experience of a rock concert or football game. The concert gives people an experience of a common belief in the beautiful, or what they believe is beautiful, because the fantasy brought by the songs excites our vulgar tendencies, and everyone is on the same wave. In that sense, it's a transcendent experience. On the other hand, you could have 4 generations together watching and hearing Amazing Grace played by a large military band and all be affected the same way. Any one person in any group, anywhere, would be affected by this. It does not appeal to our vulgar desires as kids, but we like it anyway. Beauty and taste are about feeling, but are they subjective or objective? If we compare my taste for Kiss music to the taste of the adults, we may think that the adults' taste was correct and that we were wrong because we had the soft, thick, and empty skulls of children and teenagers. There is no objective principle to argue that Kiss was good or bad. There is no agreement, no rational principle to support either position. On the other hand, everyone is affected by the bagpipes playing Amazing Grace. Everyone is affected the same, so there must be objective principles in taste and beauty. Taste, or having good taste, is having a shared sense of beauty with everyone else. Before we delve deeper, it's crucial to introduce the concept of the antinomy of taste. This philosophical dilemma suggests that, on the one hand, there is no objective principle, on the other hand, there must be. So, how can this be resolved? Both assertions are correct, leading to a conflict or an apparent one. So, let's go back to 9/11 to illustrate 2 ways of thinking and clarify this. We saw the explosions and the buildings collapse in what can only be described as a perfectly executed textbook example of controlled demolition. You don't see other controlled demolitions go off this smoothly. There was a cause for the explosion. Everything happens for a reason. This was a deterministic judgment based on causality. Bombs cause explosions. On the subject of aeroplanes being involved, we cannot deduce that they were not involved based on the lack of supposed evidence of planes being involved. So far, we don't have a very high standard of truth either way, whether aeroplanes were or were not involved. Maybe the parts of the aeroplanes were stolen, or it could be that no one found them. So far, there is no good reason to think planes were involved if we are to keep our heads. Using purely reflective judgment, we can determine that the assertion that planes are involved is absurd. No one would expect to get a perfectly executed textbook example of a controlled demolition if an aeroplane crashed into the building just before the charges were set off. So now, going back to music, we can say that there are no objective principles of taste because my generation, and I loved rock and roll, while my parents hated it. On the other hand, we all liked hearing Amazing Grace on the pipes. There must be an objective principle because we all agreed, and the only thing we can all agree on is objective principles. So, we think of an objective principle in terms of logic, because this is true, and that is also true. But we have no rational tenets from which to judge taste. No law of physics, art, or a mathematical theorem can guide us, unlike in 9/11, where we know that bombs cause explosions. This deterministic judgment requires a principle, of which there is none. Unlike deterministic judgments, which rely on principles, reflective judgments are free from such constraints. This distinction is crucial, as it allows us to collectively appreciate amazing grace, guided by a reflective principle of judgment. An ex-slave trader wrote the song Amazing Grace about his conception of forgiveness. It would not be the same if the lyrics were about a singer arriving home and stumbling out of his car in a drunken state after an evening spent in debauchery, satisfying carnal desires. If you were to walk through a beautiful garden and later discover that all the plants were fake, you would feel disgusted. The human experience is a dialectic interplay. Our minds, equipped with reason and understanding, mold our experiences. Judgment acts as the bridge between these two faculties. For instance, you witness an object in motion, comprehend its movement, and, through judgment, deduce a cause. If none is apparent, you run or hide under the bed. The sublime experience of a rock concert, with its 10,000-person crowd, is captivating precisely because it stirs a conflict between imagination and reason. This tension is unsettling, yet this very interplay captivates and even frightens. The terror experienced is within the realm of safety, reminding us of the power of and supremacy of reason. It's a humbling experience, and humility makes us wise. On the other hand, beauty is different in that it is an interplay between understanding and imagination. You can see a beautiful machine, like maybe a Ducati turbine-powered motorbike, or a well-executed plan, and call this beautiful. That kind of beauty is connected to a purpose, so in that sense, it is not pure beauty. Pure beauty in art is when the purpose is not what draws you to the conclusion that the object is beautiful, the interplay between imagination and understanding continues, and your interest is maintained. A form or concept not expected or sought emerges in the mind. Something about the song, Stairway to Heaven, creates this interplay between imagination and understanding, and it's not in the music, it's in the words. The actual interpretation of the words, unique to each individual, may mean something different to different people. In the context of this book, the lady is a fool, all that glitters really isn't gold, and she can go back and change the road she is on. There is, quote, still time to go back and change the road you are on, unquote. It speaks to the principle of grace. There is no correct interpretation. It may mean something entirely different for someone else. This interplay between imagination and understanding deepens our appreciation of art and elevates our thinking to a higher plane beyond the mundane and vulgar. The Marxists, in their cultural revolutions, want to keep us in the profane, satisfying animal desires, and not thinking about things like grace, respect, beauty, or right. This judgment also applies to the moral domain. The taste for the beautiful and the good are connected. The sublime creates respect for reason in its supremacy above mere understanding. Imagine if you were a couch potato and decided to take karate lessons. All the other students starting in the class are on a hockey team. You would expect to get beat up all the time during sparring because their coordination and speed skills would be transferable. Earlier, I said that Marxism was antithetical to sanity. Sanity is knowing and practicing the difference between right and wrong and having a taste that is within acceptable bounds. It's in bad taste to defecate on a sidewalk. The insane violate principles of the good, beauty, and taste. Good art, in good taste, excites our minds through the interactive play between understanding and imagination, and gets our minds active in ideas beyond the vulgar. With this judgment practice, such a mind is better able to make judgments involving higher principles, is more accustomed to them, and is more conscious not only of beauty but of morality as well. The new conceptions of beauty that now envelop us are antithetical to sanity because they prevent us from going beyond the vulgar and thinking on a higher plane. Marxist art is often repulsive. Earlier, the topic of standards of truth was explained. The standard of truth in proving that Karl Marx was a total asshole met here is higher than the standard of truth required for a murder conviction, which merely requires a beyond a reasonable doubt, and less than that of a mathematical theorem, which is absolute certainty. The standard of truth behind the statement that Marx was a total asshole is about equal to the standard of truth met by the above 9/11 conspiracy theory, but in right rather than in fact. Marxist actions give us a reason for the assertion, the empirical evidence of an absolute and pure form of evil. Earlier in the book, I mentioned Plato and the conception of the ultimate good life depicted in Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic could not argue against the notion that the best life to be had was to be a categorical asshole, but to have everyone believe you are a saint. Kant explains that when we practice virtue, our conscience lets us believe that we deserve the finer things in life. Virtue allows us to see and appreciate beauty and good on a higher plane. This lack of virtue and actual illumination could be the thing leading communists to sadism in all of its forms. It would be both naive and narcissistic to believe that the devil could not capture you. It could be that you weren't captured because the devil didn't need or want you. Retaining humility is not just a virtue, it's a source of wisdom. Wisdom and judgment are crucial to refrain from making judgments based on emotion, as emotions lack rational principles. By avoiding purely emotional judgments, we can feel more enlightened and empowered and stay connected with others. Only in objective judgments can we all agree. In ordinary law courts, juries decide guilt or innocence, but the judge must determine the sentence. Otherwise, sentences can become vicious and fierce when handed down by juries. Be careful when judging others, and only judge a man once you have walked a mile in his shoes. The famous book Political Ponerology by Andrew M. Lobachevsky can be found freely online. Its preface says this will be the most important book you will ever read. It's a bold statement, many people agree. With their conclusions, the old Polish docs described in this book understood this problem we face and what to do about it. Its message is one of grace. It really is the most important and relevant book you can read today. I wish everyone would read this essential book. The Asshole Problem. Chapter 5: Equality, Hate and Racism. I've often been accused of being a racist. This accusation has come from my stance on honest money, that is, the people who we vote for as legislators or get appointed to our judiciary should cooperate directly with those who print money, rather than those who print money dictate and be unaccountable to no one. Private central banks create kings who must either be assholes or wear a crown of thorns. Kings need assholes working directly under them. In short, honest money would reduce the number of assholes to a near minimum, to that which naturally occurs, stunted development and mental illness. Our Western countries would not need all the wars and foreign occupations that keep economies dependent on privately owned central banks and their interest-bearing currencies. In a system of honest money, elected officials would no longer have to serve two masters, in which case, the essential asshole requirement for elected officials would be eliminated. Politicians could have great respect and admiration. This honest money belief has nothing to do with race. These things are only linked through the magic of Hollywood and network television, public education, and what people openly, and without reservation call programming. Kings do not like the idea of honest money because it puts kings in a position to be accountable to rational, objective law. Consequently, people are programmed to equate the desire for honest money with racism by the assholes of Hollywood, network television, and public education. The earlier chapters of this book have given people the tools to think more clearly, that is, to separate thoughts into terms of fact and right. In this chapter, I will examine racism using this better doctrine of thought, which was applied throughout all of the works of the sage of Königsberg. If someone claims to be a racist, are they racists in fact or in right? Do they even know? To be a racist, in fact, one must hold the belief that some races are inferior to others in terms of abilities. I don't understand how one could make this determination. Perhaps it's with IQ tests, a science that I do not understand, have no faith in, and is outside this book's scope. Suppose you take an IQ test. 3 hours later, you say, I just got my IQ tested, and my score was 130. This is tricky ground. No one knows what the I actually means. Suppose I ask the doctor I get to test my IQ about man causing the phenomenon of global warming. In that case, the answer will be in the affirmative. They will always recommend vaccinations. Part of the purpose of the book is to get people to stop listening to assholes. I don't believe that known assholes should be trusted, and that our trust in assholes has led to this near destruction of juristic societies. The relevancy of IQ tests needs to be questioned. Of course, scientists will say they can assess intelligence based on cognitive tests. Scientists say they can do many things. If people didn't have much faith in science, many scientists would be out of work. It's the business of scientists to make the public think of them as oracles rather than people practicing in a field of minimal scope. It is a requirement of Marxist ideology that people only think in terms of fact, leaving questions of right to their owners. Racism serves the needs of tyrants and kings by dividing people, creating conflict and the need for a king. Let's suppose there is a hierarchy of abilities between the different races. Should this affect how we judge and deal with people? Kings naturally choose people with high intelligence and poor judgment to work directly under them, as the famous book Political Ponerology explains. An example of poor judgment is that anyone who joins a secret society of any consequence signs an open-ended contract. Anyone who signs an open-ended contract can be said to have impaired judgment. This would never show up in an IQ test. Judgment cannot be taught, and a big part of it is what Kant referred to as mother wit. Judgment must be learned from experience, so people are typically recruited to join these organizations only when they are young. Of course, you cannot leave and will become a member for life. Welcome to the Hotel California. People can be hired to commit suicide, and the best examples of people like this are the professionals who, indirectly, work for the kings. Let's suppose that scientists show us that blue people have, on average, 10 points more than green people on IQ tests. In everyday meetings and interactions, it may still be that the green people you interact with are more intelligent than the blue people you know. The aggregate means almost nothing for individual experiences. Regarding right, should people scientists believed to have better genetics be afforded more rights? In this case, how would the line of demarcation be drawn? Would there be an error? If so, who would be responsible for that error? In a world where people are judged by their actions and observable abilities, responsibility and authority would balance, creating a sane environment. If blue people are more intelligent than green people, we would naturally have more blue doctors than green ones, and more green janitors than blue ones. It would not matter to the greens or the blues, each is in a position where they have a healthy and sane balance of authority and responsibility, and can meet the requirements of their jobs. Kings control social movements that have a form of racism built into their ideologies. This creates division and conflict that cannot be resolved without a king. It creates populations on both sides that can be characterized as victims of arrested development, that is, people needing a king to resolve or prevent conflicts. Our lack of moral education and independent thought creates the need for kings. Children need parents. The kings created an environment of arrested development to make more statutes and have greater control over people. The racist label can be placed on anyone who disagrees with the king. It has no objective principles. Examples of Marxist hatred are numerous. The one cited in the previous chapter is likely the most severe, but the feminist notion of a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle is another. The new racism created by entitlement is another. White Christians are being targeted, just like in the Bolshevik Revolution. Christianity demands objective and fair law, so kings demand fewer Christians. It's an essential aspect of Marxism to always accuse your opponent of the things you are doing to draw off suspicion. This is a big part of their practical doctrines in destroying juristic societies. This is in the famous book, Rules for Radicals, by Saul Alinsky. This is why Marxists are always talking about hate crimes supposedly committed by others. In short, racism is nothing more than a tool for assholes who oppose rational and fair laws and this objective universal requirement. Both blues and greens would lose freedom from being ruled by kings, and gain nothing in return. Communists often talk about equality without specifying equality in right or fact. The two are mutually exclusive. It has to be one or the other. Equality, in fact, gives equal outcomes and eliminates responsibility, and therefore, authority. Your fate is in the hands of the king. Equality in right means that everyone has equal rights. This is only possible under a universal and objective science of jurisprudence, and with people who balance authority with responsibility. Equality, in fact, is a tool of kings, from which wealth can be controlled. Equality in right is a doctrine of a free society, unencumbered by assholes. Multiculturalism is the idea of mixing people who wish or need to be ruled by the kings and tyrants of ethical systems and statutory religions with people who want to be governed by principle and law and live in a juristic society. It's diabolical. It dilutes natural right and any objective rule of law with favoritism, corruption, hierarchies, and eventually extermination of those who expect objective law, and extreme oppression for those who survive. Only the stupid and the evil can lead us toward multiculturalism. There are people of all colors who need to be ruled with force rather than reason. Bringing them into the West and setting them free is to weaponize them against juristic systems. Kings will arm, fund, and house them for as long as necessary, and simply dispose of them when they are no longer needed. Multiculturalism and racism are both tools for those who wish juristic systems to be destroyed. We have all been hoodwinked into multiculturalism by kings and people with impaired judgment or evil intent. So, that's all, folks. And this is the end. And that's about it. This book is off the giant commercial sites or in the Library of Congress, and if you got this far, you liked it, so please save it and share it.